Before we begin, I want to remind you about Chilling, the Scary Stories app that I'm a narrator on, which will very soon become Chilling 2.0, a full-fledged platform which will include video content in addition to all the stories. Full-length horror films, series, and exclusive Chilling originals are just some of what Chilling 2.0 is bringing to horror fans. It's being crafted by horror fans for horror fans. So download now and start your free trial to see if you like it. There's so many popular narrators on Chilling and over 1,000 stories with hours more being added every week. Lastly, Chilling is now accepting investments from the public and investors are starting to take notice. You can get in on it now before the share is projected to increase in value greatly, so don't miss out. Chilling is a must-have app for horror story lovers, and Chilling 2.0 will change the game completely. The links to download and check out the investment page are all down in the description below.
Joke's on you!
On August 16th of 1980, the Australian family the Chamberlains went on a camping trip to Uluru, formerly known as Ayers Rock, the famously titanic sandstone rock formation on Australia's Northern Territory. Designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, Uluru is sacred to the Anawu people and is the site of numerous freshwater springs, watering holes, rock caves, and ancient Aboriginal paintings. And naturally, due to the immense natural beauty of the area, Uluru has been a popular tourist destination for almost 100 years. The Chamberlains' first day and night camping in Uluru were relatively uneventful, and the family passed the time relaxing at their campsite while their children played atop the red, sandy earth. Keeping an eye on 7- and 4-year-old sons Aiden and Regan proved to be a handful, as their parents had welcomed their daughter Azaria into the world just 2 months prior. Some might argue that it was a little too soon after labor to go on a camping trip, but the pregnancy had been a hard one, and both Lindy and Michael Chamberlain were desperately in need of some rest and relaxation. But the trip would ultimately prove to be anything but relaxing, and would in fact turn out to be every parent's worst nightmare. According to both Michael and Lindy Chamberlain, they had first spotted a pack of dingoes shortly after they had made camp on August 16th. A dingo is a kind of Australian wild dog, one with a remarkably similar appearance to contemporary domesticated dogs. But that's where the similarities to our familiar furry friend end, as dingoes are said to be considerably faster, stronger, and much more ferocious than domesticated canines. It became apparent that the dingoes could smell the family's food cooking away on a small camping stove, and slowly but surely they edged closer and closer to the camp. At first, the closer encounter with such wild creatures thrilled the Chamberlains, with Michael even tossing them a few sandwich crusts for them to feed on. Yet unbeknownst to him, that would prove to be a huge mistake. For the previous 2 years, Uluru Chief Ranger Derek Roth had been writing to the local government to warn them of an uptick in the region's dingo population. Due to an abundance of natural prey, the years leading up to 1980 saw an explosion in the number of dingo packs that roamed the region. Increased numbers caused a strain on the dingo's natural sources of prey, and soon, more and more packs were finding themselves with considerably less to eat. As a result, dingo packs were becoming increasingly aggressive, approaching and sometimes biting people, and Derek Roth warned that it wasn't long before something terrible occurred. Which is why when Michael Chamberlain threw those crusts, and the dingoes identified the family as the source of potential food, he'd inadvertently put his family in serious danger. Then, around 8 p.m., Michael and Lindy put their children to bed and returned to the campfire to get a moment alone together. Sometime later, the couple heard something moving around the tent where their children were sleeping. Assuming it was just one of them rolling around in their sleep, they didn't seem to think much of it. But when they heard one of their young sons cry out in terror, The couple leapt into action. They arrived at the tent, finding that each of their young sons were terrified, but otherwise unharmed. Azaria, however, was nowhere to be seen. The Chamberlains asked their sons where Azaria was, but they didn't have an answer. Each had been asleep, and they were awoken by some rustling at the mouth of the tent, but it was far too dark and far too sudden for them to work out exactly what it was. The two parents searched frantically around the nearby area, but not a trace of their daughter could be found. And the sad truth was that neither Michael nor Lindy would ever see their baby girl again. But that's not what makes this abduction story so horrifying, as the pain and suffering of the family didn't end with the abduction of their daughter. And for Lindy in particular, things were about to get unimaginably worse. As you might imagine, police were called in and the campsite was blocked off before forensic examiners pored over the tents and surrounding area. They noted animal prints on the floor of the tent, and a park ranger found what he believed to be dingo tracks leading from the tent and off in the direction of some rocks near the base of Uluru. Police followed the faint trail, and to their horror, found blood-stained clothes belonging to the 2-month-old Azaria. The initial inquest into Azaria's disappearance was opened in Alice Springs on December 18th of 1980. 2 days later, in the first ever live broadcast of Australian court proceedings, Magistrate Dennis Barrett ruled that the most likely explanation for the child's disappearance was a dingo attack. However, Barrett had a rather chilling addendum to his statement, adding that following the initial dingo attack, the body of Azaria was taken from the possession of the dingo and disposed of by an unknown method, by a person or persons, name unknown. This is based on the fact that there seemed to be evidence suggesting that someone had actually undone some buttons at some point after Azaria had been taken. This was a horrifying enough revelation from the parent of any missing child, but the police's conclusions turned a living nightmare into marching through hell when they accused Lindy Chamberlain of murdering her own child. Northern Territory police and prosecutors had always suspected Lindy's involvement in the disappearance of her own daughter, and even after the investigation was officially concluded, officers continued to work the case. This led to a second inquest in September of 1981. Based on ultraviolet photographs of Azaria's jumpsuit, medical experts alleged that there was a tiny cut around the neck of the baby's jumpsuit recovered from the surrounding bush. Essentially, they were implying that someone had cut a 2-month-old baby's throat, that someone was evil enough to murder young Azaria Chamberlain. And in their view, that person was her own mother. We can only imagine the horror of the moment Lindy was accused of killing her own tiny baby. The universe had somehow found the one solitary way of compounding the mind-breaking grief she was experiencing. It was like a sick cosmic joke, and she no doubt told herself that it couldn't be happening. Only it was. It was reality. Lindy was about to stand trial for the murder of her own newborn baby. At her trial, the state prosecution had alleged that at some point, and with her husband's consent, Lindy had gotten up from the campfire and walked over to the tent in which her children slept. She then carried a sleeping Azaria to their family's car, changed into a pair of tracksuit pants that she intended to subsequently dispose of, then used a pair of scissors to cut her 2-month-old daughter's throat. Then, according to prosecuting attorneys, Lindy held her baby upside down by the ankle and waited for it to bleed to death. Expert witnesses claimed that there was no evidence of arterial bleeding from the jumpsuit bloodstains, and it would take up to 20 minutes for Azaria to die if her mother had cut her jugular vein and not her aorta. Allegedly, when Lindy was sure that Azaria was dead, she hid the body of her young daughter in a camera case and tried not only to clean up any blood that had gotten in the car, but also to collect enough of it to smear on the interior of the children's tent to simulate some kind of animal attack. The prosecution said she did all that without ever attracting the attention of any other camper, and that this all went unnoticed during the first inquest due to a combination of luck, careful concealment, and painstaking planning on the Chamberlains' part. Lindsay's defense lawyer focused on eyewitness statements which detailed the dingoes that were in the area on the night of August 17th. It also pointed out that many of the tests used by the prosecution to prove that Azaria's blood was in the car were faulty, and showed that mucus and chocolate milkshakes also tested positive for blood using these same techniques. The defense also called on a man named Les Harris, who at the time had been conducting research into the Australian dingo population for well over 10 years. It was him that testified that a dingo's carnassial teeth can shear through material as tough as motor vehicle seatbelts. He also cited an example of a captive female dingo removing a bundle of meat from its wrapping paper and leaving the paper intact. To the Chamberlains, it seemed like a foregone conclusion. There was an airtight explanation for the daughter's disappearance, a tragic one, but surely no jury would favor the idea of a mother murdering her baby daughter over the increasing encroachment of aggressive predatory animals. But they did. On October 29th of 1982, a jury of her peers found Lindy Chamberlain guilty of the murder of her own baby girl, with the judge then handing down a sentence of life imprisonment. Her husband Michael was found guilty as an accessory after the fact and was given an 18-month suspended prison sentence. As she was dragged away, a horrified Lindy Chamberlain loudly protested her innocence, apparently screaming out, "A dingo ate my baby," before bailiffs managed to escort her from court. I think it's objectively difficult to imagine how horrendous it would be to lose a child, only then to be convicted of that child's murder. In the prison she was held in, Lindy found she was the subject of a phenomenal amount of hatred. To her fellow inmates, she was a child killer, the lowest of the low. Those that had it in them to kill children, to kill babies, didn't deserve to live themselves, and as a result, Lindy had to be held in a special wing of the prison reserved normally for those in protective custody. She was in a unit with actual child killers, predators and abusers that looked at her and thought, one of us. The trauma of that no doubt played a part in Lindy repeatedly lodging appeals, two of which were quashed by both the federal and high courts of Australia. For almost 6 long years, Lindy remained in prison, trying to keep it together, trying to fight on. But there came a time where she believed that her luck had run out, and that she was doomed to spend the rest of her life in prison for something she hadn't done, something she'd never even think about doing. It's believed that her outlook became so bleak that she considered taking her own life. But every time, thoughts of Michael and her 2 young sons kept her from entertaining such masochistic ideas. And it's a good job too, because in early 1986, an unforeseen event would once again turn the media spotlight back onto the disappearance of Azaria Chamberlain. And in a bizarre twist of fate, justice would loom out yet another untimely death. David Brett had a passion for climbing, and sometime in the mid-1980s, David decided he'd combine his love of mountaineering with an Australian vacation to a bird's-eye view of the land down under. But as it would turn out, David's attempt to climb Uluru would be the last thing he'd ever do, as he tragically fell to his death during a routine climb in early 1986. Because of the vast size of the rock and the scrubby nature of the surrounding terrain, it was 8 days before Brett's remains were discovered, lying below the bluff where he had lost his footing. His body showed evidence of having been picked over by some kind of scavenger, and this is how search and rescue operators found the dingo lair just meters away from David's body. To ensure the dingoes hadn't dragged any of David's body parts into the cave with them, operators scoured the cave for potential remains and came across something stunning. It was a tiny baby-sized mountaineer jacket, one that had belonged to none other than Azaria Chamberlain. The Chief Minister of the Northern Territory ordered Lindy Chamberlain's immediate release and reopened the investigation into Azaria's disappearance. Then, on September 15th of 1988, the Northern Territory Court of Criminal Appeals unanimously overturned all convictions against Lindy and Michael Chamberlain, and they were officially declared not guilty of their daughter's murder. 2 years later, the Chamberlains were awarded $1.3 million in compensation for wrongful imprisonment, a sum that covered less than one-third of their legal expenses. They were outraged. They wanted an apology. They wanted justice. But what the Australian government chose to give them was a slap in the face. It took until February of 2012 for the Northern Territory coroner, Elizabeth Morris, to offer an official apology for the injustice the Chamberlains had faced. But by then, it was too little too late, and the horror of what the family endured would never be erased or forgotten. But perhaps what's more abstractly horrifying about the accusation of Lindy Chamberlain was just how willing the general public were to believe that she killed her baby. By all accounts, the media's representation of the case was highly polarizing, and the case is now used as an example of how media and bias can adversely affect a trial. There have been many accounts of people spreading fanciful rumors or making sick jokes about the child's disappearance, and how newspapers were keen to sell a story of an evil, murderous mother simply because it sold more copies. People also judged Lindy on the way in which she grieved, with some saying her media appearances made her look cold and unsympathetic. They said she didn't cry enough, that she didn't seem broken enough, and as a result, people chose not to believe her. Much was made of the Chamberlains' Seventh-day Adventist religion, including false allegations that the church was actually a cult that killed infants as a part of a bizarre religious ceremony. At one point, police received an anonymous tip from a man who claimed to be a close associate of the Chamberlains, and that Azaria was a name that meant sacrifice in the wilderness in some ancient satanic language. According to the Chamberlains, Azaria actually means blessed by God, and by all accounts, the man was nothing more than a lunatic. But it goes to show just how willing people were to paint Lindy as some kind of witch. And much like the witches of Salem, Massachusetts, Lindy was publicly sacrificed to satisfy some primal craving for justice. Like it couldn't have been an accident, it had to have been someone's fault. Someone had to be sacrificed. Azaria's death became such a worldwide phenomenon that it's been referenced in all kinds of media, including The Simpsons and Buffy the Vampire Slayer. In fact, you probably heard the phrase, "Dingoes ate my baby," way before you even knew what a dingo was. And there's a good reason for that. It's because the world is a big, scary place, and it's still full of monsters. And the idea that even in 1980, nature could still reach out and hurt us, so seemingly randomly, for many, that was a bitter pill to swallow.
Humans are ready. Prepare for pride. A good hound never knows its way home.
Born on January 17th of 1991, Lauren Spear was the daughter of Charlene and Robert, an accountancy couple from Scarsdale, New York. After graduating from Edgemont High School in 2009, Lauren enrolled at Indiana University. She was an active and good-natured young student and volunteered for many charitable causes. For example, she had spent the previous spring break planting trees in Israel on behalf of the Jewish National Fund, combining her two passions of travel and public service. As you can imagine, Lauren's attitude made her a very popular young woman, and her circle of friends seems to have been a consistent and positive one. You see, Lauren had met her college boyfriend, Jesse Wolf, as well as her best friend, Jay Rosenbaum, during a summer camp in the hillside town of Holmesdale, PA. And a handful of her other close friends at Indiana University had also attended the summer camp. The point is, it seemed that Lauren was part of a tight-knit unit of friends who both loved and trusted one another, which makes it all the more alarming when we learn what happened to her. On the night of Thursday, June 2nd, 2011, Lauren and her friends visited the nearby Kilroy Sports Bar. In an effort to save on what little cash they had, Lauren and her friends partook in what's known as pre-gaming, where people drink store-bought alcohol before going out to a bar or club. The group of friends were also notorious for only venturing out into the night during the wee small hours. Kilroy's also catered to this kind of crowd, keeping their bar open until 4 in the morning, and CCTV footage from that night doesn't show Lauren and her friends arriving until about 1:46 a.m. For the first 45 minutes or so, everything appears relatively normal. Lauren and her friends have drinks, they dance, they play pool, everything you might expect from a group of college kids soaking up the nightlife. But then, around 2:27 in the morning, Lauren's behavior takes a somewhat bizarre turn. It's around then that Lauren gets up and walks out of the bar, leaving her cell phone on the bar top and her shoes on the floor near her seat. After exiting Kilroy's, she is then quickly followed by a friend named Corey Rossman. Rossman seems confused as to why Lauren left her things behind, but seems only too happy to follow her back to her apartment complex. At exactly 2:30 a.m., Corey and Lauren enter the Smallwood Plaza Apartments complex that Laura called home. It's here they remain for exactly 28 minutes before CCTV once again captures them leaving the apartment complex. Only instead of walking back to the bar, where Lauren's phone and shoes are still sitting there, Lauren and Corey walk down an alleyway that connects College Avenue and Morton Street, the same alley where Lauren's purse and apartment keys would be found the following day. CCTV footage then catches Lauren and Corey arriving at the latter's apartment at around 3 in the morning. This footage shows Lauren to be a little worse for wear, but Corey Rossman is somehow absolutely trashed by this point. Corey's roommate, Michael Beth, later said that he had to clean up a puddle of vomit that Corey left in the stairwell that same night, and that Corey was so drunk that he had to be put to bed. Michael added that once this was done, he then tried to persuade Lauren to sleep over for her own safety. However, Lauren insisted that she wanted to return to her own apartment, probably citing her need to find her missing possessions. And so at 3:30 a.m., Michael Beth called Lauren's friend Jay Rosenbaum, telling him he needed to come take care of her. We can only assume he answered in the affirmative because a short while later, Lauren shows up at Jay's apartment with a rather large bruise under her eye. Jay later said that he was worried about the injury, but after Lauren told him she didn't know how she obtained the bruise, Jay assumed she'd gotten it during a drunken fall from earlier in the evening. However, of all the CCTV footage we have of Lauren and her friends, there are no recorded incidents of falling, and no recorded incidences of people fussing over her eye, which we could then use to estimate the time and place of such an injury. By 4:30 a.m., Lauren hasn't had an alcoholic drink in over 2 hours, and is no doubt beginning to sober up. Granted, she wouldn't have been in the best condition of her life, but she is no doubt realizing that she's lost pretty much everything she brought out with her, being her phone, keys, shoes, and purse. In light of this, we can understand why Lauren was reluctant to sleep it off, when she could actively go about recovering some of her lost items. Lauren then left Jay Rosenbaum's apartment at around 4:30 that morning, last being sighted on CCTV footage headed south from the intersection of 11th Street and College Avenue. Several hours later, Lauren's boyfriend, Jesse Wolf, sent her a text which she failed to reply to. And when reply did finally roll in, it was from an employee of Kilroy's sports bar, saying Lauren had left her phone there overnight. Not long after, given he had zero means of getting in touch with her, no one had seen her that morning. Jesse contacted the local campus police to report Lauren missing. After 3 weeks of fruitless search, August of 2011 saw local police and FBI agents undertake a week-long search of the nearby Sycamore Ridge landfill site. Needless to say, it wasn't looking good for Lauren, as cops were evidently looking for a body, or more accurately, parts of a body, as opposed to a living, breathing person. But despite their efforts, law enforcement didn't manage to find a single shred of evidence that clued them into Lauren's condition or where she might be. The investigation dragged on for years without a break, and this is in spite of more than 3,000 tips called in from the general public. Then, on the morning of April 25, 2015, a hint of Lauren's fate was unearthed not far from where she went missing. Yet it goes without saying that it was not a good one. The lifeless corpse of a University of Indiana student, Hannah Wilson, was discovered in neighboring Brown County. She was last seen getting into a taxi in front of the very same bar that Lauren had visited on the night of her disappearance. Lying on the ground near her body was a cell phone, one the police determined was owned by a local 50-year-old man by the name of Daniel Messel. He was arrested, tried, and convicted of Hannah's murder, and police deduced that he might well be the same person responsible for Lawrence Spearer's disappearance too. However, in July of that same year, nationally renowned private investigator Bo Dietl concluded that after his own extensive investigation, he'd found nothing to seriously link Hannah's murder to Lauren's apparent abduction, and any similarities were purely coincidental. Yet right when it seemed that all hope was lost, the winter that followed Hannah Wilson's murder saw the FBI pursue its first serious lead. In the early hours of January 28, 2016, FBI agents were assisted by local law enforcement in serving a search warrant to a property in the 2900 block of Old Morgantown Road in Martinsville, approximately 20 miles north of Bloomington. The rather dry official statement from law enforcement was that they were following up on leads and tips in Morgan County regarding the disappearance of Lauren Spearer. But in reality, they had strong suspicions that a man named Justin Wagers was responsible for her murder or abduction. Wagers, who lived with his mother and stepfather, had been named and identified on multiple occasions as having exposed himself to local women during incidents that were characterized by aggressive and generally terrifying displays of depravity. Cops let cadaver dogs loose in the Wagers' home and found that they indicated there were human remains in a nearby barn. However, after conducting a dig and sifting dirt from the floor of the structure, investigators found zero evidence of anyone having been buried there. As the years went by, Lauren's parents sadly announced that they believed their daughter to be deceased. Yet they've also been very open about their suspicions that someone very close to her may have been involved in her disappearance. Not only have they wondered aloud if someone might have slipped something in her drink while she was at Kilroy's, they also had no qualms with casting suspicion on the man she was with that night. Lauren's boyfriend at the time, Jesse Wolf, has also professed his distrust of Corey Rossman, Michael Beth, and Jay Rosenbaum, as not only did all three refuse to take police-issued polygraph tests, but all three lawyered up in the days following her disappearance, apparently completely unprompted to do so, as she was still considered very much alive at that time. Rossman, Beth, and Rosenbaum then publicly stated that they had passed privately administered polygraph tests, which apparently proved their innocence. They were also completely unapologetic regarding them hiring attorneys, and stated that their refusal to cooperate with Bloomington police was down to them not trusting law enforcement. A theory was batted around that Lauren may have died as a result of a drug overdose, one resulting from narcotics obtained from either Rossman, Beth, or Rosenbaum. If that was the case, it's possible that all three, or a combination of the men, could have conspired to dispose of her body so that their guilt would never be suspected. Obviously, hiring lawyers and refusing to take a polygraph doesn't exactly make the three guys look good. But in all fairness, it's highly inadvisable to talk to police officers without a lawyer present, especially since all three guys knew well their friend was missing. What's more, polygraphs are so unreliable that they're no longer admissible in court, and the police were most likely just looking to get the three guys in an interview room so they could browbeat them into incriminating themselves. So, in light of that, we have to consider other options. But having exhausted the possibilities of either Daniel Messel or Justin Wager having killed her, time and time again we're forced to consider the accidental overdose angle. I truly don't think it was a random abduction. I think that somebody that Lauren knew was responsible for the events of that evening, her mother publicly stated in 2014. And she may well be correct. Statistically, most people are murdered by someone they know, sometimes pretty intimately too. and it doesn't seem out of the question that those three young men with big, bright futures ahead of them wouldn't want to throw them away by admitting they'd given a girl too much to drink or too much of something a little less than legal. So as much as people focus on stranger danger, or of that random creeper who becomes the source of their untimely demise, maybe people should start looking a little closer to home, to those who profess to love or care for us, who might actually disappear us, dispose of our body, or bury our names, just to protect themselves. Westbrook's upbringing wasn't one we would call easy. In 2011, when she was just 7 years old, her parents John and Rona went through some of the most bitterly nasty and spiteful divorce proceedings one can imagine. Rona began petitioning the court of Hamilton County, Tennessee, for primary custody of Daphne in March of 2016. A judge then ruled in her favor, stating that John would only have custody of Daphne every other weekend, as well as ordering him to pay a substantial amount in child support. Rona added that her daughter started to thrive when she received primary custody, adding that she became more outgoing, got her first job, and generally seemed more happy. On top of that, the performance at Chattanooga State Collegiate High dramatically improved, and soon Daphne envisioned herself graduating with both her high school diploma and an associate's degree. Then, on October of 2019, Daphne went over to Chattanooga to spend the weekend with her father. 2 days later, Daphne told her mom that she may be arriving home a little later than usual, as she and a friend wanted to take her father's dog for a walk. Her mother agreed, but Daphne failed to return home. Rona immediately called all of the friends of Daphne's that she had contact details for, but no one seemed to have made any plans with her. Unable to get her daughter on the phone, Rona panicked and reported her missing. She didn't hear back from her daughter for 2 days, and when she called, Daphne seemed angry that her mother had filed a police report. She stated emphatically that she wasn't missing, but as Rona tried to reason with her, Daphne hung up the phone. It was a week before Rona and Daphne spoke again. As soon as Daphne answered her phone, Rona noticed that she was talking in a strange tone of voice. And when her mother asked her where she was, Daphne flat out refused to say. Rona then asked who Daphne was with, but again, she completely refused to reveal any other information other than that she was okay. When Rona pressed her for more details, Daphne hung up the phone. As you can imagine, Rona was absolutely terrified for her daughter's well-being and actively began scouring social media for any clues of Daphne's whereabouts, be it mentions from friends, check-ins, or recently posted photographs. It's believed that these efforts, along with posting comments which inquired about Daphne's location, caused someone to send a short video to Rona. Yet instead of giving her any solid answers, the video did nothing but terrify Rona, along with raising many questions as to what in God's name was going on. The video is shot in almost complete darkness, so much so that Rona began to question if the girl in the video was even her daughter to begin with. Moments after she'd watched the clip, the anonymous sender of the video message suddenly deleted it. And to this day, it's not clear who exactly sent it, be it Daphne's father, a third party, or even Daphne herself. Preliminary investigations led both police and Daphne's immediate family to believe she had simply run away from home. It was common knowledge that she'd struggled with mental illness, and that she'd not responded well to the news of her father's work-related departure for Colorado. After confessing to having thoughts of taking her own life in the same year she disappeared, Daphne's depression had been treated with medication, and she was beginning to show signs of improvement. However, Rona mentioned that her ex-husband had been extremely critical of the decision to medicate Daphne, and had forbidden her from seeing a doctor or taking her pills whenever she was in his custody. Detectives believe that denying her access to her meds was partially to blame for any apparent decline in Daphne's physical or emotional state, further emphasizing the need to find her and bring her home. Her mother, stepfather, and grandparents pleaded for her to reach out and let them know she was safe, but to no avail. Neither Daphne or her father ever tried to reach out to them again. As for Daphne's father, John Westbrook, it was initially speculated that he had nothing to do with his daughter's disappearance, as he actually cooperated with police for a brief time around the beginning of 2020. Even Daphne's maternal grandparents seemed satisfied that John wasn't to blame, and it seemed he'd at least made an effort to play the concerned and loving father. Yet it soon became obvious that John was lying, and after his immediate family members demanded that he cut the nonsense and bring his daughter back to them, John simply dropped off the face of the earth. By June of 2020, he had officially been charged with custodial interference, but it's clear that John had no intention of facing these charges, as around the same time they were filed, animal shelter records from Albuquerque, New Mexico showed John had stopped by to pick up one of Daphne's dogs, which had apparently gotten loose at some point during their journey. This was all the confirmation that law enforcement needed to conclude that Daphne was most probably in the company of her father, as there was no way she'd have allowed herself to part with her dogs. It was just a case of tracking them down. Yet unless they could be sure that she was being held against her will, all of law enforcement's efforts would be in vain, but it wasn't difficult to make a case for her abduction. Daphne wasn't always the happiest of girls, but she was tight with her close-knit circle of friends. In the custody of her mom, Daphne was constantly back and forth with her girlfriends using various social media apps. But in the company of her father, her communication became sporadic and increasingly melancholy. What's more, law enforcement began to piece together a picture of Daphne's father, a man who was far more dangerous and ruthless than they could have possibly imagined. John Westbrook made his living in IT, specifically in the field of cybersecurity. He was also very well versed in Bitcoin and blockchain technology in general, and police believed he was using his expertise to conceal his movements. Since the father and daughter were so difficult to reach on their cell phones, law enforcement deducted that their cell phones were virtually always wrapped in aluminum foil to prevent incoming and outgoing calls. They also assumed that John was either denying his daughter the use of her laptop, or at least installed applications that essentially made her invisible online. There was also no danger of John running out of money and being forced into a mistake that way, as it was determined that he had not only invested a sizable amount of money in Bitcoin, but he was able to work small IT jobs on the fly. And what little information the cops were able to obtain only served to make John Westbrook seem like an even more intimidating figure. In the time since he disappeared, the cops estimated John to have used at least 15 different email addresses, 10 ID cards with varying pseudonyms, and at least 3 different vehicles. It also became apparent that John purchased hair dye and a set of false teeth, leading police to believe that he may have developed an elaborate disguise in order to avoid capture. The situation wasn't looking good. Law enforcement knew that they were dealing with a shrewd and resourceful man who could very well remain one step ahead of them at all times. They couldn't shut down his assets, they couldn't trace him online. For all intents and purposes, he was a phantom, one they'd have to rely on lost dogs to catch. We've contacted the Interpol Crimes Against Children unit, and it's impossible to trace what he's doing, said a member of the Hamilton County District Attorney's Office. Yet perhaps most disturbing of all, the DA went on to allege that John Westbrook was actually drugging his daughter to prevent her escape. We believe Daphne has this odd affection to him now because prior to her disappearance, John would give her alcohol, marijuana, LSD, and mushrooms. And he's now, we know from recent witness interviews, that she's constantly drugged and/or drinking alcohol provided by him. Shortly after the disappearance at the Albuquerque dog shelter, John and Daphne went dark and didn't resurface until February of 2021, when a Bible belonging to Daphne was found discarded in a garbage can outside of a Trader Joe's outlet in Santa Fe. Police believe that they were closing in on the pair, but it appears they acted too hastily, as Daphne then found a way to contact a friend to say that they were on the move again and that she wanted to take her own life. This gave the apparent abduction a new sense of urgency, and on February of 2021, John was charged with aggravated kidnapping and flagrant non-support. The FBI went public for the first time, releasing statements that Daphne was in danger and asking the citizens of Colorado and New Mexico to keep their eyes peeled. Due to the increase in media attention, there were several reported sightings in places like Gunnison, Colorado, Seattle, Washington, and Tampa, Florida, but nothing that could be confirmed as concrete facts. Yet slowly but surely, more and more reports came in from Florida, phoned in by people convinced that they just sighted Daphne and John Westbrook. There was one from Fort Walton Beach on March 6th, and another from Sebring just a few days later. It's then that authorities discovered a relative of John's named Starla just so happened to live in Sebring, Florida. So sometime during the week of March 5th, authorities executed a search warrant at Starla's home and seized all of her electronics. Each device was analyzed, but not a single shred of evidence could be found. And once again, all Rona could do was pray for her daughter's safe return. She's been taken away from everyone she knew, her friends, everything. All just gone, vanished, Rona said. And I don't have enough words for that. The things that we have learned are very scary and very disturbing. We're just so eager to find her and so that we can help. Then on May 28th of 2021, the Amber Alert regarding Daphne's abduction was canceled. But unlike so many cases where the story ends with finding a dead body, a now 18-year-old Daphne Westbrook was found safe and sound in Sampson, Alabama, only 9 miles away from Florida state lines. Although it's not clear what condition the young girl is in, we can be thankful that she turned up alive in a world where so many abductees do not. Hamilton County District Attorney's Office released a statement on Facebook which read, "We are thankful Daphne is safe and no longer being held by her father. It is especially gratifying to be able to tell her mom that Daphne is free and no longer being hidden. But this doesn't change our goal to find and prosecute John Westbrook. Our investigations remain active, and we expect new developments within the next couple of weeks. It'll be interesting to see just how this case unfolds over the next year or so. If John Westbrook will or even can be caught. And if he is, how in God's name is he going to justify giving his teenage daughter hallucinogenic drugs? Was it a way to control her depression without conventional medication? Or was it simply a dangerous and nefarious way to control a person he believed belonged to him? Did love push a father to protect his daughter in some pretty unconventional ways? Or did that love become twisted up until he could justify just about any maltreatment in order to keep her to himself?
Minions have spawned.
On the morning of Tuesday, September 20th of 1988, 19-year-old Tara Calico left her home in Belen, New Mexico to begin her daily bike ride along the New Mexico State Road. Cycling was her favorite form of exercise, and she chose a route she'd ridden every morning, without fail, for years by that point, and was often accompanied by her mother, Patty Dole. However, in recent weeks, Patty had ceased to join her daughter in her daily rides after one particularly frightening incident in which she believed the pair had been stalked by an angry motorist. Patty had implored her daughter to stop cycling at that time in the morning, or to at least take a different route, but her daughter rejected the idea and said her mother was overreacting when it was suggested that she carry mace. That Tuesday morning, Tara had noticed one of her hamstrings feeling a little tight. She mentioned this to her mother and added that if she wasn't home by 12, it was because she was probably injured, in which case, her mother was to drive down the regular route to give her and her bike a ride back. We can also assume that Tara desperately wanted to be back around that time, as she had a date at around 12:30 and wanted time to get ready. And indeed, when Tara failed to return by noon, Patty drove down their usual cycling route, but couldn't locate her daughter. But what she did find were the broken pieces of what was unmistakably Tara's Sony Walkman. Patty immediately contacted the police, suggesting the broken pieces might represent some kind of trail for them to follow. Police did indeed follow the trail of broken plastic, but to no avail. Several witnesses were interviewed, each saying they had seen Tara riding her bike along the state road. One or two even added that they had noticed a light-colored pickup truck following closely behind her, but hadn't really thought anything of it at the time. Police cast a wide net in the search that followed, but not a single trace of Tara or her bicycle could be found. It was as if though she'd ridden into a black hole, like she just dropped off the face of the earth. Yet little did they know, they would be seeing Tara again. Only the circumstances in which they'd see her would be truly terrifying. On the evening of June 15th, 1989, a woman in Port St. Joe, Florida, stopped at a local convenience store. She pulled into a free parking space next to a large white windowless Toyota cargo van, and as she got out, noted that it was being driven by a mustachioed Caucasian man who appeared to be in his 30s. She then walked into the store, picked up a few choice items, then headed back out to her vehicle. The Toyota cargo van was gone, but lying in the empty parking spot was a small square Polaroid photograph. At first glance, the picture appeared to be of two people lying amongst some bedding, but on further inspection, the contents of the photograph made the woman's blood run cold. It showed a young boy of maybe only 7 or 8, along with a young woman in her late teens. Each appeared to have their wrists bound behind their backs with a strip of duct tape covering each of their mouths. She immediately contacted local law enforcement, who in turn set up roadblocks to intercept the vehicle. But the van was never found, and the driver never identified. Representatives from the Polaroid company offered to analyze the picture before informing police that the picture could have been taken no earlier than May of 1989, as the kind of material used to print the photo was not available until then. The Polaroid's discovery sparked a frenzy of interest in the national media, and Patty Dole was contacted by friends who believed the gagged girl looked an awful lot like Tara. The FBI then brought the photograph to Patty, who was then on convinced that the girl in the picture was her missing daughter. She cited the scar on the bound girl's leg, one that was identical to one Tara had received as a result of a car accident. Patty also noticed that a paperback copy of V.C. Andrews' novel My Sweet Adrena can be seen lying next to the girl, a book that just so happened to be Tara's all-time favorite. The United Kingdom's Scotland Yard analyzed the photo and conclusively agreed that the woman in the picture was indeed Tara, but a follow-up analysis by the Los Alamos National Laboratory disagreed, citing differences in the girl's facial structure. However, when the FBI conducted a third analysis of the photo, the results were inconclusive. They were 75% sure it was her, just enough to officially declare it, as it might muddy or misdirect any potential investigation. The other young person in the picture was thought to be young Michael Henley, also of New Mexico, who had disappeared just a few months before Tara had. Michael's mother said that she too was almost certain that it was her young son tied up in the Polaroid. Yet this was considered highly unlikely, as Michael's remains were discovered in June 1990 in the Zoom Mountains, less than 10 miles from the family's campsite he vanished from. Police believe that Michael simply wandered off and subsequently died of exposure, and if that were the case, there was no way the child in the van could be him. Two other possible Polaroid photographs of Tara had surfaced in the years since her disappearance. The first being discovered near a construction site in the small town of Montecito, California. It is a blurry photo of a girl's face, with tape covering her mouth and light blue striped fabric behind her. Many have noted the blatant similarities between the fabric to that on the pillow in the Toyota van photo. It was taken on film that was not available until June 1989. The second Polaroid depicts a woman loosely bound in gauze. Her eyes are covered with yet more gauze and large black framed glasses, and she's standing with a male passenger beside her on an abandoned Amtrak train. The film used was not available until February 1990. Calico's mother believed the first was definitely Tara, with her sister saying that the two girls had a striking, uncalming resemblance. As for me, I will not rule them out, but keep in mind our family has had to identify many other photographs, and all but those three were ruled out. Many years went by without any arrests or developments in the case. Then, in 2008, rumors spread that two teenage boys had accidentally hit Calico with a truck, panicked, and subsequently killed her, covering up the misdeeds by disposing of her corpse somewhere it would never be found. But this was dismissed as pure hearsay, and the police officer who made the comment was publicly chastised by Tara's stepfather for that. 5 more years went by, and we could be forgiven for thinking that Tara's case would remain a cold one. But in 2013, the FBI announced that they had set up a 6-person task force that was to be charged with reinvestigating Tara's abduction, citing the discovery of new evidence. Then in 2019, the FBI followed up their announcement by offering a reward of up to $20,000 for precise details leading to the identification or location of Tara Lee Calico, and information leading to the arrest and conviction of those responsible for her disappearance. So it seems the FBI are creeping ever closer to finding the person responsible for Tara's death or abduction. And that even if 30 years goes by, the powers that be will not simply allow people to go missing without doing something about it. So the question remains, was it really a freak car accident that killed Tara? One in which a terrified teen found he couldn't face the consequences.
Enemy double kill.
Or was Tara kidnapped by someone with much more nefarious intentions? Someone who wanted to show off his monstrous labors by displaying his quarry, bound and gagged, his playthings until he saw fit to dispose of them. But at the end of the day, we're only left to wonder in horror at Tara's fate at the hands of her captor, left only to pray that the same thing doesn't happen to us or any of our loved ones. June 25, 1986, a Volvo F12 cargo truck carrying pure sulfuric acid raced through the Somosierra mountain pass near the Spanish capital of Madrid. It began overtaking other vehicles at alarming speeds, and in one case passed so close to a car that it smashed a side mirror clean off. It then appeared as if the Volvo was attempting to pass another truck, but instead, it swerved at the last second, smashing the unsuspecting truck completely off the road. Suddenly, the Volvo veered into the path of oncoming traffic at speeds of up to 87 miles per hour, colliding with another truck with such force that both vehicles were violently overturned. The impact had been so destructive that it had ruptured the cargo hold of the Volvo F12, sending a wave of pure sulfuric acid washing over the surrounding highway. As rescue workers poured sand and lime onto the acid to neutralize it, they were also greeted by the sight of a man and woman. Both were naked, bald, and sitting motionless in the cab of the first truck. Each had been completely bathed in the highly concentrated chemical substance in the moments immediately following the crash, and the results were about as horrifying as you can imagine. Their clothes and hair had been the first things to be dissolved, and acid was well into the process of burning and dissolving their flesh. They had no doubt died in complete agony, and the damage to both their bodies and the interior of the truck made identifying them extremely difficult. They were eventually identified as Andres Martinez and his wife, Carmen Gomez, and authorities contacted Carmen's mother to inform her of Carmen's tragic demise. Her response was chilling. But what about the boy? Please tell me my grandson is okay. The boy she was referring to was 10-year-old Juan Pedro, Andreas and Carmen's only child. He too had occasionally joined his mother and father on their shorter trucking journeys, but never one that long. Yet examination of the truck's cab revealed a number of children's cassette tapes, along with several items of the child's clothing in the back. Some were heavily corroded, but it was clear which age group they were intended for. Yet there was absolutely no trace of young Juan in the cab of the truck. Once it had become clear that the body of a young boy was missing, residents of nearby villages and towns descended onto the crash site and began digging through the sand and lime in the hopes of uncovering Juan's body. They also searched the crags and crannies of the Somosierra Pass, but not a single trace of young Juan was to be found. While some believe that Juan was completely dissolved by the sulfuric acid, chemists maintain that there is no way that the acid could have dissolved his body that quickly, and that if it had, there'd at least be extensive skeletal remains left behind. However, expert chemists did suggest that it might have been possible for one of the pass's rock formations to act as a kind of bathtub, collecting enough acid to form a pool that Juan's body just so happened to have been thrown into. It seemed like an unspeakably ghastly twist of fate, but it was very possible, and if it was indeed the case, it would have taken no longer than 24 hours for all soft tissue to dissolve. It would take another 5 days for Juan's bones to be reduced to mere fragments. Yet it would still be possible to recover nails, teeth, and certain items of clothing made of polypropylene. Detectives scoured the surrounding hills for any signs of such a bathtub rock formation, but nothing satisfying such criteria was discovered. And so the question remained. If Juan had been in the truck at the time of the crash, where was he now? Detectives began to study the truck's tachometer and found the device showed that the couple had made 12 short stops during the ascension of the Somosierra Pass. Truckers that usually drive that route say that they usually make one stop at most, aside from mechanical problems, and couldn't think of a reason why a person would stop twice, let alone 12 times. It's also been established that there was no traffic jam that would explain the odd stops. An analysis of the truck showed that the brakes were not damaged, meaning each stop was entirely deliberate. And this is where the story gets deeply disturbing. Remember the trucker who was run off the road by the speeding Volvo? He gave a statement to the police saying that after he'd managed to gain control of his vehicle, he climbed out of the cab, only to be greeted by a man and a woman with bright blue eyes and golden blonde hair. The woman spoke Spanish well, but did so with a rather distinctive Germanic inflection, as she told the startled trucker not to worry, and that she and her colleague were medical professionals. The trucker allowed the couple to check his injuries, but found that they soon moved on to the acid-washed crash site, where he watched them retrieve some kind of package from the wreckage. After that, they climbed back into a small white windowless van and drove away. It's now believed that this package was the body of young Juan Pedro Martinez. It's not clear if the boy was alive or dead when these strange Nordic-looking medical professionals pulled him from the truck's obliterated cab. It's also unclear just who exactly they were and how they seemed to know that there'd be a crash that day. Spanish police were unable to locate any such individuals, and Juan Pedro's disappearance remains a hauntingly perplexing mystery, right up until today.
An enemy has been slain.
January 13th, 2014, 43-year-old Chad Olson walked into a Tampa Bay area movie theater with his wife, Nicole. The couple had decided to spend a little quality time together, leaving their 3-year-old daughter, Lexi, in safe hands of a trusted babysitter, while they went to see the 2013 war movie, Lawrence of Arabia. Those who've experienced being a young parent will tell you that private moments like the one they hope to share are far and few between, and we can only imagine how much they've been looking forward to it. However, as the Olsons nestled into their seats and the lights began to dim, another couple walked into the movie theater. That of 71-year-old retired police captain Curtis Reeves and his wife, Vivian. Their police officer son, Matt, had actually read Marcus Luttrell's account of surviving swarms of Taliban in the hills of eastern Afghanistan. So, when the movie with the same name came up, he naturally recommended that they go see it. But what neither couple knew is that a relaxed afternoon movie visit was about to turn into a living nightmare. And that shows how an everyday disagreement has the capacity to turn deadly. As Curtis and his wife took a seat in the row just behind the Olsons, he began to hear a rather irritating clicking sound. In the silence of darkness of the movie theater, it didn't take him long to figure out that the sound was coming from in front of him. As he peered over the seats in front, there was Chad Olson, illuminated by his own cell phone screen, hammering away at the keys to his phone without having bothered to put it on silent. Curtis was irritated, but even the previews had yet to commence, so he held his tongue. It was only when the movie theater screen came on and a message about switching off cell phones was played that Curtis actually tapped Chad on the shoulder and asked him to stop texting. According to court documents, Chad replied that he was just texting his 3-year-old daughter and that he'd be done in a few seconds. But this wasn't good enough for Curtis, who then added something about how Chad should think of other people. According to Vivian Reeves, Chad then turned and spoke very aggressively towards her husband, insisting that he'd continue to text his daughter until he was finished. "It scared me," she said later in court. "I was horrified that somebody would act like that, especially in a movie theater." By that point, Curtis was done trying to reason with the increasingly belligerent Chad. He turned to Vivian, whispered, "I'm gonna get a manager," then rose from his seat and left the theater, true to his word. When he returned, she handed him the popcorn and he sat down. According to witnesses, it's unclear who reignited the conflict upon Curtis's return. But what is clear is that Curtis informed Chad that he'd informed the theater's manager of his rude behavior, and that he was due to be thrown out at any moment. "You told on me?" Chad reportedly barked. "Who do you think you are?" It's then that witnesses say that Chad reached with his tub of popcorn, aggressively emptying it all over Curtis's head. "It happened very quickly," Vivian Reeves later said. "His whole upper body just came forward and I thought he was coming over to attack us. But in reality, although the move was an aggressive one, Chad had no intention of actually harming the older couple. He simply wanted to humiliate them." Regardless of intention, seconds after the popcorn went flying, the movie theater was lit up by a single bright flash. Curtis Reeves had pulled a .38 revolver from his hip and sent a bullet ripping through Chad's torso. Chad's wife had actually gotten a look at Curtis producing the handgun, and in a moment of pure horrified instinct, she lunged forward and tried to put her palm over the barrel of Curtis's weapon. She didn't move fast enough, and the bullet tore through her hand, shattering bone and shredding muscle, before plunging into her unsuspecting husband. The formerly silent theater was now filled with the screams of those trying desperately to escape, mistaking the situation for one of a far larger scope and scale. Realizing what he had done, Curtis sat back down in the seat, put his hands on his head, and tried to comprehend just how much one foolish act would change the lives of everyone in that theater. An off-duty police officer who just so happened to be present at the time as the shooting slowly approached Curtis, took the firearm out of his lap and rendered it safe. The same officer later testified that Vivian turned to her husband and said, "What did you just do? You can't shoot into a theater full of people." Curtis simply cradled his head in his hands in a state of near catatonia, as if he couldn't believe what he'd just done. The terror was only compounded for responding police officers and emergency medical technicians. They knew very little of what had occurred at the scene, other than there had been a shooting in a movie theater. For some of them, this was highly reminiscent of the mass shooting committed by James Holmes in July of 2012, in which a heavily armed man let off tear gas in the Colorado movie theater before slaughtering the terrified moviegoers. Some people thought it was some kind of viral stunt, the purpose of which was to promote the movie. They sat smiling until Holmes opened fire, and it was only when they saw the dead that they realized what was happening. "We had no idea what we were headed into," said one officer following Reeves' arrest. We didn't know how many victims, how many shooters, what they were armed with. I was scared that it might be another Aurora, but thank God no one else was hurt. It's true that Chad Olson was the only casualty of what could have been a much more violent event, but even so, the one death shattered a young family, and all who knew Chad were horrified and heartbroken that such a senseless death could even occur. It's just going to be a huge hole in everyone's lives for him and his family, a friend of Chad's named Joe Trapani is reported to have said. He'd give you the shirt off his back if he needed to. He was just an all-around great guy. It was a couple of words, no threats, no harm, no nothing. Nicole Olson later testified in court. In the blink of an eye, 30 seconds, it just shattered my world. Curtis Reeves' trial is set to begin this year, having been long delayed by the COVID-19 crisis. And although he already entered a plea of not guilty, it seems highly unlikely that any jury in DeLand will find his actions to be anything other than abhorrently violent and thoughtless. Reeves tried to invoke Florida's notorious Stand Your Ground laws back in his initial hearing in 2014. And although a man should indeed have the right to defend himself from legitimate threats, what threat did a bag of popcorn really pose? The terrifying thing about this particular murder isn't so much the violent outcome, it's how an everyday disagreement could somehow snowball into an actual murder. Not only that, but by all accounts, Curtis was an upstanding member of society, having never once committed any kind of crime prior to that day. In addition to his impeccable service in the U.S. Navy, Curtis has 9 letters of appreciation and an excellent duty award in his Tampa PD file. He was also a member of the local Crime Stopper Board, a civilian crime prevention network based in his Hernando County home. Even a neighbor of his, Bill Costas, spoke kindly of him when contacted by the media in the aftermath of the shooting. He was just a really nice guy, Bill said. Always smiling, and I've never seen him angry. A friendly type of guy, you know. If I ever needed help with anything, he was always willing to lend a hand. What people are saying about him just sounds like a totally different person. It just doesn't make sense to me, not from what I know of him. Curtis was certainly not a loose cannon, so why just snap all of a sudden? What makes a man like that suddenly lose all rationality and react to mild belligerence with a deadly response? We can try to rationalize such a violent event, explain it away using natural or supernatural means, but the truth is, you never really know who's out there, who you're going to bump into or rub up the wrong way. Some people won't be so forgiving over seemingly minor offenses, and just the slightest pushback could give them all the reason they need to widow your spouses or orphan your children. Be heavily involved in the LA goth scene in the late 80s. I met some of the most amazing people ever, and I've stayed friends with some of them right up until today. But I think they'd be the first to agree with me that the goth scene back then was a bunch of kids trying to be something they weren't. And in our case, that thing was vampires. We were into the whole vamp thing heavy. Like we heard about the faux vampire enclaves in New York that were involved in bloodletting and blood drinking and all this other hardcore stuff. And I guess we just wanted to emulate that. The darker our meets and parties got, the weirder the people we attracted. And although I call BS on one of our number claiming that Richard Ramirez, that's the Night Stalker serial killer, approached us about attending one of our parties, we still got some pretty sketchy people hanging around. Sure, we talked a good game about bloodlust and death and slaughtering the cattle, as we phrased it, but we were just bored, slightly depressed kids. There wasn't any malice in what we were doing, and no one ever got cut or drank from unless they 100% consented. That being said, there were definitely 1 or 2 people that passed through our little social circle that most definitely didn't have the best intentions. And being the dumb, attention-craving teenager I was, I ended up pretty much falling into bed with one of them. There was only like one other gay guy who used to hang out with us, but I really wasn't into him at all. So when Zeno showed up, I just about lost my mind. Zeno was from Hungary, and I guess he got sick of trying to teach Americans how to pronounce his actual birth name, Joel. Then he just went by his teenage nickname of Zeno. I was already swooning when he showed up. 6-foot-tall goth guy from Europe with jet black hair and dark eyes. But then when I found out that he was bi, oh my god, I just about did a somersault. So yeah, I get talking to him one night, offering up my wrist for him to do a little bloodletting, and we hit it off. Super cringy thinking about it now. What else is youth for other than to get all your dumb mistakes out? Anyway, we basically start dating, and I'm just on top of the world telling all my gay friends about this bi guy from Hungary. It was just the best. He's just so moody and dark, constantly wearing black even though the Cali heat must have been killing him. He once told a friend of mine, my blood is cold in a sexy accent. Again, super cringe, but screw it. I was hopelessly in love. Only one of my friends, just one, seemed to have the presence of mind to warn me about him, saying something like, yeah, I've been getting really bad vibes off of Zeno like all night. It's just got bad news. That's exactly what I liked about him though. He was bad, but I thought he was like just at the upper echelon of the same way we were. But to my horror, Zeno turned out to be an actual psycho who I never should have dated in the first place. Again, uber cringe alert, so I'll keep it brief. Zeno was super dumb, and I was super subby. If you know, you know. And a big part of his power trips was to ask me like, would you do anything for me? How far would you go? What are you willing to give me? And every time I'd be like, yeah, anything, as much as you need. This idea just snowballed and snowballed until one night he asked me out on what he called a very special kind of date. I pressed him on what he meant by that, but all he'd given me was, this is LA after all. Why don't we go to the movies? I knew he wasn't about to just take me to see Terminator 2 or whatever. I knew there had to be some kind of twist in there, and that there was a lot more to this little date idea of his than just catching a flick. So I bit my tongue and just waited for the Friday night in question to see what he had in store for me. The time comes. He comes to pick me up in his Turk. Yeah, you read that right. Guy bought an old funeral car for his ride, and we head downtown. Again, I ask him where we were headed, but he just smiles and tells me, you'll see. After about 10 minutes or so, we pull up outside an old adult movie theater, so naturally I'm getting excited, but when I ask him if we're having a little adult entertainment date, he shakes his head and gives me this wry smile. So by this point, my curiosity is piqued. I have no idea how weird this date is about to get. I sure was about to find out. I get out of the car and realize that the place looked closed. Like normally you'd have a marquee, flashing lights, or at least something advertising what movies were being shown. But this place had nothing. Not even any lights on, and like I said, it looked like it hadn't been open for years. There wasn't even anyone manning the ticket booth. We had to like bang on the front doors until someone showed up to let us in. At the time, I just guessed that Zeno had prepaid or something because he and whoever was playing as being the steward seemed to know each other and no money exchanged hands. He just leads us into one of the theater rooms that was almost pitch black, with only a handful of other people sat around waiting for whatever movie was about to be shown. I'm practically vibrating with excitement by the time it comes for us to take our seats, and as we do, he leans over me, takes my hand in his, and says like, you get scared. Squeeze my hand. It's okay if you get scared, but we stay. Not leaving. Okay? Now, he was dark, but had a heart of gold. He could show me his sensitive side from time to time, and good lord, now that he'd shown me that, I was never leaving his side. Or so I thought. Because I figured we'd just gone to see some messed up Eurotrash horror film that had been banned in the US or whatever. Something gross but harmless where I'd end up cuddled up next to him, scared but not too scared, if that makes any sense. What little light there was in the theater dimmed and the screen came to life. But instead of having a title sequence or anything like that, a man in a black mask walked in front, lit up by the projector, and began to speak. I can't remember exactly what the guy said. It was like 30 years ago now. And what I saw next kind of overshadows everything that came prior. But he basically said something like this in some overly dramatic mid-Atlantic accent. Ladies and gentlemen, what you are about to witness is no mere fiction, and is not for the faint of heart. This is true cinema verite, the naked truth of our lives laid bare, and to view it is almost as sacred as an act as to partake in its creation. So, without further ado, allow me to present L'amour de. Please don't hold me to the film's title. That's literally just what it sounded like to me with my 2 years of high school French. Moments later, the guy stepped away from the screen and the movie began. Again, there were no title sequences. The movie just started. And I know this is dumb, but I thought the big guy's speech at the start was supposed to be like build up hype or whatever. I didn't think he was serious. So when a picture comes on the screen of a semi-naked girl tied to a metal surgical table, I immediately start thinking, oh no, oh please no, this can't be what I think it is. The girl doesn't seem to be struggling or anything. She's just lying there all limp in front of some boxes with that crazy Russian-style writing on them. I knew something bad was about to happen, but whether or not it was all just an elaborate facade, it was just too soon to say. I know I should have just gotten up and left right then. But well, the things we do for love, huh? I give Zeno's hand a squeeze and a man comes into view. At least, I'm 99% sure it was a guy, because they were all covered up in those loose-fitting surgical scrubs. He walked into frame with what looked like 2 electrodes, placed them on the girl's chest, then like nods to someone out of frame. The girl's body spasms all of a sudden, then she starts freaking out and struggling, where she's clearly been shocked into consciousness, only to be confused and terrified by her surroundings. That's when the man in the surgical mask begins to speak, and although I honestly couldn't tell if it was actual Russian or not, as I know a bunch of different countries use that kind of writing, he definitely sounded like he was in Eastern Europe somewhere. And as much as I obviously didn't know what he was saying, it definitely sounded like he was taunting or berating the girl who was tied to the table. The guy in the surgical mask then makes a show of tightening the restraints, with one kind of pulling her hips down so she couldn't move. I'm thinking, they have to give her anesthetic, right? If this is some kind of horrid surgical footage, they're sure to knock her out before they cut her open, right? Wrong. I was squeezing Zeno's hand as hard as I could as the guy on screen picked up a scalpel and began to cut into the girl's stomach. I tried my best to watch, I actually did. But as soon as I began to see all kinds of shimmering organ meat underneath the surface, I found myself forced to turn away. I thought Zeno would understand. I obviously just wasn't on his level when it came to actual gore. Cutting was one thing, but seeing that girl's guts on display made me want to puke. I thought he might see that he tried to push me too far, too soon, but he didn't. I felt him push me away and softly growl something like, "Keep watching, don't look away." I tried to keep as quiet as I could and not make a scene, but I begged him, telling him it was too much for me. He then told me that if I didn't watch, if I didn't at least try, he'd leave me here and never, ever call me again. This went on for a few minutes, and while my eyes are glued shut, things are still occurring on screen. Only I can't see them, obviously. Zeno's little ultimatum hurt, but I couldn't just let him go like that. He was like my dream guy, and I swear I'd done anything for him. Turns out, though, there was a line, and he'd crossed it. But still, I tried. Yet when I opened my eyes, it was so much worse than it had been before. The girl was such a mess that I actually gasped when I saw, and how a person can still be alive, writhing around and groaning when most of their intestines have been unraveled on their stomach. Jesus Christ, that image still sticks with me even 30 years later. I just couldn't handle it anymore. I couldn't even believe I was doing it at the time, but I shoved his hand away from me, got up out of my seat, and just walked out of the theater. When I got back to my apartment finally, I cried for like half an hour straight, just ugly sobbing before I got it together enough to call one of my friends and tell them what happened. We didn't go to the cops or anything. I mean, maybe we should have, but I just prioritized on getting Zeno out of my life as fast as possible. I slowed down on the whole band thing after that. Zeno continually hung around that circle, so I just couldn't drag myself to meets and stuff. Seeing him flirting with girls or whatever just really tore me up inside. I'm kind of non-confrontational too, so maybe these days people would have singled him out as toxic or whatever, but back then, trying to speak out against the coolest guy anyone knew just seemed kind of pointless. I think the moral here is to have more respect for yourself than I did. Dom-sub dynamics are fun, sure, but I let that mentality get me into a situation that honestly could have turned out way worse. If you ask me, someone that's into snuff, that's into like watching people die, that's gotta be only a few steps away from actually committing violence themselves, right? So who knows? Maybe if I'd met Zeno further down the spiral, I might not even be here to tell you this story. Because I made a real mistake getting stuck on that guy. And I literally have the scars to prove it. When I was a student, I worked in this tiny cinema in London's Soho district. There used to be loads of little picture houses that showed raunchy films back in the day, and I'd rather die than end up working in one of those. But back around 1990, some well-to-do musician type bought up one of the little cinemas and converted it into like a cult film cinema. I'd show all kinds of weird foreign films and documentaries, video nasty horror films from the previous decade, and it'd even host secret showings of banned films like that Italian Cannibal Holocaust film. But one of the things the little cinema was most famous for was showing these hardcore, ultra-violent Japanese anime films. These were a huge hit with locals and students alike, and some of the weeknight showings of things like Violence Jack or Angel Cop used to fill out more than the weekend showings of more mainstream films. These are kind of like the OVAs, that's manga jargon for original video animation, that have been straight up banned in certain countries because of how violent and obscene they were. Well, for their time anyway. The point is, they weren't easy to get their hands on, especially with English dubbing or English subtitles. So when we announced the showing of something particularly gruesome, you could bet we'd get bums on seats for weeks on end. It tended to be a lot of the same people coming each week too. Regular little cliques of anime addicts or gore hounds who shrieked and whooped whenever there was a particularly nasty kill. Most of them looked the part too. Leather trench coats, tattoos, lots of heavy metal band t-shirts.
30 seconds
But then
to minion spawn.
one or two didn't look like the kind of people to be watching cult Japanese animation whatsoever. I suppose you can't always judge a book by its cover, but one particular guy looked so out of place that it was downright creepy. Me and the other guy who used to work the afternoon shift used to just call him the Man in the Hat. Because, as well as being immaculately dressed in this navy blue suit and tie, he wore this old-fashioned wide-brimmed hat, the kind you'd see back in the 40s or 50s. First time he walked up to the booth before a showing and said, "One please," in his posh accent. I was sure he was lost. I actually asked him like, "One for Mad Bull 34? And he just nods. So, not being one to deny the bloke a new experience, I took his money, gave him a ticket, and unlocked the little turnstiles for him to push his way through. Then, while everyone else is basically turning the place into a madhouse, showering each other in lager and cackling whenever anything gory happened, the Man in the Hat would just sit there, silently and happily watching the film. He didn't seem like a wrongin', just a bit weird is all. But then something happened during the showing of one particularly violent film that seemed to, well, push him over the edge, so to say. So there's a part in this one film where these two fellas are having a scrap and one suddenly gets the upper hand and he rips his opponent's heart right out of his chest. Admittedly, it makes for some bloody amazing viewing, as it's not like a hi-ya, one and done thing. No, the bloke like hulks out, makes a kind of karate chop hand and then plunges it into his opponent's chest. Then, while he's actually got his hand wrapped around the enemy guy's heart, he starts giving him this big speech about how he never stood a chance, how he's got his very life force in his grip. Then, with literal showers of blood occurring, the guy crushed his opponent's heart, rips it out of his chest, and what follows is like a lawn sprinkler of blood just going absolutely everywhere. Not the kind of thing you'd watch with your granny on a Sunday afternoon, but it definitely made the time pass quicker at work when you're sitting in the projection booth like, what in God's name is I even watching? This is insane. Well, smoking a little bit of a J. Anyway, like I said, big long speech by the fella before he crushes the guy's heart, etc. The Man in the Hat had seen this particular film before. In fact, he was getting a reputation for showing up every time he showed it, without fail, and we were all about to find out why. Right before the guy's heart gets ripped out, someone a few feet down from the Man in the Hat jumps out of their seat and starts shouting something at him. Bearing in mind the actual theater wasn't very big at all, maybe only holding about 40 or 50 people at the time. So, from up in the projection booth, I can kind of see what's going on with my bird's eye view. Someone is really objecting to something that the Man in the Hat is doing, so much so that they're jumping up out of their seat, pointing, shouting, then kind of shooing him out of the row. Someone else seems to notice, and at one point, I think this person was going to actually attack the Man in the Hat, who had to rush out of the theater to avoid the increasingly angry crowd. I find this whole thing a bit distressing, as he'd always been alright with me, but I didn't know what he'd actually been up to until the end of the show. On their way out, I asked one of the customers what the Man in the Hat had been doing. Disgusting. I'm saying. Bloody Nonce was sitting there wanking, wasn't he? Don't worry, man. We've dealt with him for you, another said. But don't let that beast back in, yeah? He was looking unblurting all over your lovely red carpets. Disgusting. You know what? As horrible as it was, I was gutted. I mean, I had seen him moving a bit funny at times during the showings, but I didn't think he was touching himself or anything. God forbid, well-dressed gent like that. And thinking he was getting off on all the violence, too. Like maybe he used to pop down to Soho to visit a peep show or two, and he found himself something else to get off on. Something much darker. Anyways, years later, I'm in a pub over in the West End, seeing an old mate of mine who used to work the cinema, too. I'm not working at the cinema anymore. I have an actual grown-up job chasing down benefit fraudsters for the DWP, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't miss the cinema a fair bit. Anyway, we're doing a spot of reminiscing, and all of a sudden, he near slams his pint down and says, "Did you hear about the prosy who was murdered by the old gore mine?" What we used to call the cinema, with it being in a basement unit. I tell him no, and he reminds me of the Man in the Hat. It had literally been years since I thought about him, and I gave a quick grimace as I did, but what did that have to do with some poor woman of the night being murdered? Mate, someone picked her up, then dumped her on the street behind the old cinema, right? My old colleague said. And get this, they only went on to cut her heart out, didn't they?
You've got a problem.
Grin, but I still didn't quite see the significance.
Shut down.
Remember, what was the Man in the Hat beating his meat to when he got thrown out? What exact scene? The bloke ripping the heart out. My jaw's dropping as I'm saying this, and I started suddenly seeing the connection too.
It's not stealing if
You
you're
don't think?
dead.
That's exactly what I think. Full disclosure, yeah? I reckon my old mate is as mad as a box of frogs. Always has been, always will. But he wasn't wrong about the Man in the Hat. And unless someone else in Soho had the fancy for the old Aztec heart-ectomy, it had to be our man. It was a bit surreal, honestly. I went from calling him a plant pot to seriously contemplating it. And then within about 45 minutes or so, we were walking down to Savile Row Police Station to file a report.
Laws or
The
whatever.
copper made it clear that we smelled like a brewery, and if we made any false statements, he'd personally make sure we were in charge for it. We told him, right hand to God, this is the God-honest truth. And then we told him all about the man in the hat, and that particular scene in Violence Jack or whatever it was. He soon changed his tune. About an hour after, we were soon talking to two blokes from the CID who wanted to know every little detail about the man in the hat. That's how we knew we were on something. If there were no callbacks, no return interest from the coppers, then yeah, red herring. But the fact it got passed up the chain and then these two booted types jump up on the case, something's going on there, don't you think? As far as I know, he was never nicked for it and the murder actually went unsolved. It's scary that, isn't it? Thinking you might still be out there or what have you. So when you're next in the pictures and you see some fella wearing an old style hat, sit a couple of rows back from him, will you? Because it's likely that's not popcorn butter that's spilling on there, if you know what I mean.
You have been slain. Enemy double kill. An enemy has been slain.
Get paid and get out.
So it was only about a week after that Joker movie came out that I got a chance to see it. I'd been a huge fan of the Nolan Batman series. Like, I loved how dark they made it. So the idea of having a dedicated Joker movie where everyone was saying how controversial it was, I was so psyched to see it. I can't find anyone to come see it with me, but I didn't care. I just rocked up to an afternoon showing on my lonesome, just tunnel vision like, Joker movie, gotta see it. I got popcorn, a soda, hot dog, the works. Just like when I used to go see movies with my
An
dad when I
enemy
was a
has
kid.
been slain.
Then as I'm sat there in the dark, I start thinking to myself, you know, I always thought someone might pull some psycho nonsense at one of these showings. But it's weird because I hadn't heard anything about psychos in clown makeup shooting up in the theaters. That's cool, I guess, but it would really suck if I just so happened to have picked the one showing of Joker that ends up getting shot up by some neckbeard incel, I thought to myself. But as I'm thinking this, the movie starts, latecomers file into the theater, everything is chill, and not a single person I can see is cosplaying or looks like they're about to erupt into violence. So, cool. I just carry on watching the movie. Then like 20 minutes in, there's only like 10 or 20 other people in the theater, and I hear someone laughing from the back of it. It's just kind of a subdued giggle at first, like the person's trying to contain themselves. But then it gets louder and louder, and it's obvious this person is just trying to get a rise out of everyone on purpose. People start turning around to see some absolute douche nugget dressed head to toe in Joker-style colorful pants and jacket. He's obviously walked into the theater in the last minute or so, because he definitely wasn't there at the start. And as he's doing this terrible impression of Arthur Fleck and doing a little dance, people start telling him to shut up and
An
recruit.
ally has been slain.
Right then, the guy pulls out a freaking revolver from the back of his pants, and people literally start screaming and getting down on the ground. Again, me included. I'm crouched down, making a move for the end of the aisle closest to the emergency exit. Don't get me wrong, I'm scared out of my wits, but at the same time I'm thinking, I knew. Of all the times, dude, of all the times, it had to happen to me. I can still hear the guy laughing, and I can still hear people begging him not to shoot as I sprint towards the emergency exit. Then, just as I'm about to open up, I look back to see the guy aim the gun at this terrified couple and pull the trigger. But instead of a flash, a bang, and one of the couple dropping to the ground, this absolute monster literally has one of those stupid toy guns that shoots out a little flag that says bang on it. It was made of plastic, but in the low light of the movie theater, and with all the terror that the Aurora Dark Knight thing caused, people were so ready to believe that it was real. When everyone realized what had happened, The guy burst out laughing again. Only this sounded like actual laughter, not the stupid Joker impression. Then just about everyone in the theater chased the guy out into the parking lot and into a waiting car. I swear to God, they were about ready to lynch this guy. I mean, I was ready to kick his head in too, but I swear the couple who pretended to shoot were just about ready to murder him right there in the parking lot. So not only did this piece of human garbage think it was funny to mimic the mass shooting, he also ruined my first time seeing Joker. So if anyone had the right to murder him, I think it should have been me. Also, I ended up checking social media and whatnot the next day just in case the guy was trying to make some viral prank video or whatever, but there was nothing. Nothing even in the news about it, which is messed up because you think CNN wouldn't pass up the chance to report on some incel violence or whatever. Definitely the scariest thing to ever happen to me, let alone in an actual movie theater. Without a shadow of a doubt, was working at a movie theater in New York City in the early 80s. Sometimes when the movie ended and the lights came up, me and the cleaning staff would walk into what I can only describe as a post-apocalyptic scene. Every kind of bodily fluid or secretion you can imagine, I've cleaned it up. We had people who we thought might be dead, people who were screwing around and didn't stop when the movie ended. Every deadly sin there is, we walked in on it. But by far the worst part of the job was trying to keep order in the theater itself. We're constantly calling the cops on people who were fighting, doing drugs, just about any scumbag activity you can imagine. People did it in our theater. They tended not to screw with my coworkers and me so much as they knew that they'd have red and blue flashing lights outside, but it was still one heck of a job.
Whatever works at the
Only
time.
once did someone actually put me in any danger. But my God, was it enough to last a lifetime. I'd have the people scream and shout at me, but at 6'3", most people knew better than to get physical. But this one guy, he didn't even have to get all that violent. He didn't have to shout or scream. He had me just about soiling my pants. So it all started when I was working the late shift, 5:30 p.m. to midnight or close. And for some reason, I could just tell it was going to be a rowdy one. It was a Friday night. It was coming up on Halloween, and people were so jacked up that I'd swear it was a full moon or something too. Needless to say, I'd braced myself for one heck of a shift. But honestly, if I'd have known how messed up that night was going to be, I think I'd just locked myself in the ticket office and stayed put until closing, in which I'd probably just end up pulling the fire alarm again. Yes, I had to do that, more than once, and the fire department told me I'd be fine if I did it again. Anyway, I sell out a theater, make a show of checking some stubs, and sit back in the ticket booth to avoid the crazies. Then out of nowhere, someone walked up to the register and says, "Hey, I think someone's sick in there." I asked if they puked, and they said no, that I think they're on drugs or something. I'm serious, I think you should call 911. I didn't want to call the EMTs and then find out that someone had just fallen asleep or whatever. So I decided to just go check it out first, and if it was serious, I called 911. I followed the girl into the dark theater, and she points out who she's talking about. At the very end of one row, there was this punk rock-looking couple, crazy hair and leather jackets. The guy had his arm around the girl, and she's leaning on his shoulder. It didn't look too rough at first glance, just an unconventional couple enjoying a show of the freaky Neutron movie, as I like to call it. People sometimes ask how I remember which exact movies was showing, and I always respond with something like, when you feel like your entire world is about to end, you pick up on all the little details for some reason. So, back when I used to work the theater, I used to carry this weak little keychain flashlight that proved its worth on more than one occasion.
You can't.
I shine the light on the ground near the couple, and lo and behold, there's a bunch of puke at the girl's feet. Then I quickly shine the light on her, and yep, she's in a bad way. She obviously is not fully conscious, and She seems to be trembling while leaning on her guy, and I'm pretty sure she's either ODing or she's really sick with something. Either way, I'm calling 911. I just want to know why the punk guy doesn't seem to care that she's in such a state. So putting on my most polite, yes sir, no sir, service voice, I lean in and ask the guy if he or his
I've
lady
got
friend
values.
require any medical
They
assistance.
stack up nicely.
At first the guy just gives me the finger and tells me to get lost. Normally I just back off. No crummy job was worth getting punched in the face over. But this one solitary occasion I just couldn't walk away. You see, this dude was much older than the girl, maybe in his late 30s, early 40s, and she looked like she was no older than high school junior. It just seemed like predatory, you know? Plus, she legit looked like she was ODing. This is going to sound harsh, but I don't really care if some hardcore junkie scumbag dies, but some younger person, some girl, who could have easily gotten a second chance in life. Nah, it wasn't gonna happen on my time. But as they say, no good deed goes unpunished. I ended up making the nearly deadly mistake of reaching out and tapping this dude on the shoulder. I didn't tap him hard, it wasn't aggressive, nothing like that. It was just to let him know I'm not messing around here. The girl needs medical attention, and I'm gonna call 911, so stash whatever you got on you because this girl's life is more important than your high, you know what I mean? But no sooner had I touched this guy, no sooner had I laid a finger on him, he grabs my wrist. I mean, the speed on this guy, heroin's supposed to make you slow or whatever. That's nonsense. This guy's hits must have been working on him because he was like a freaking mousetrap. I touch him and whack. My fingers are wrapped around my wrist and he's turning in his seat to face me. Now I see him reaching into his pocket and my immediate reaction is to pull away because I think, Jesus, this guy's about to shank me. But he doesn't pull out a knife. He pulls out something else entirely. Still sharp, mind you. But what he did with it had me frozen to the spot. The theater is dark, right, but the movie screen is bright enough to light up like half of me in the sky. Just enough so I can see what he's just put to my wrist.
An ally has been
A
slain.
syringe.
Honor is the rust.
He's not pricking me with it. He's just holding it there, and let me tell you, that was like a gun to my head. People reading this in 2019 might think that a needle is real bad, and obviously, yeah, it is. But this is 1982, alright? AIDS had literally just come out of nowhere. This country was scared. Not like COVID scared, buying all the toilet paper and stuff. I mean, people wouldn't use bathrooms after each other. Everyone's love life just disappeared overnight. I mean, this didn't go on forever, and people found out how to prevent the spread, but you didn't need no comorbidities for HIV to mess you up. And for a while, people just didn't know how it spread or with who. These days, they got all kinds of drugs that can manage HIV and AIDS or whatever. I mean, Magic Johnson is still going strong. I'd never have bet money on that back in the day, let me tell you. But back then, AIDS was like a death sentence, man. And not only did that guy threaten to poke me with a needle, what he said had me just about wetting my pants. Listen, he says, I got the bug. She got the bug too. Unless you want the bug as well, I get away from us, right now. I didn't say a word as he let go of me. I just turned around and walked out of the theater. Yeah, I called 911 like right away, cops and EMTs. All the while, I locked myself in the ticket booth and told my coworkers to stay clear of the cops when they arrived. The cops turned up with rubber gloves on, like surgical gloves, and just walked the guy out of the movie theater at gunpoint. I don't think they even touched the guy until he was at the car and they put the cuffs on him. That was a scary time to be alive, man, let me tell you. And that was a scary time for me, too, obviously. But the people I feel really sorry for are the people who have to live with that godforsaken
whatever
disease
works at the
before
time.
science worked out how to fight it or whatever. That ain't no way to live, and it sure does make me feel lucky that I have my health.
Loyalty isn't earned. It's bought.
ever happened to me was when I went to the movies with my boyfriend years ago. He's my ex now, but you get the idea if I just call him my boyfriend for the sake of the story. So, we go see the Hateful Eight movie, the Tarantino cowboy one, but not Django. Right as the film starts, I need to take a whiz, so I run to the toilet, run back, and sit back down next to him. My eyes are like glued to the screen because I've already missed the first minutes or so, so when I feel my boyfriend's arm come around the seat, I just snuggle into it and keep watching. A few minutes go by and I lean my head on his shoulder. He gives the top of it a little kiss and we carry on watching. Another few minutes go by and a guy 2 rows in front starts acting all weird like he's looking for someone. He's looking
I'll
left,
fight for
looking right. Then he turns around to look behind him,
Ally has been
and it's my
slain.
boyfriend. I instantly recoil from whoever I was cuddling with, and it's just some guy who had a similar hairstyle and beard, a totally different guy. My gut reaction is to be like, oh my god, I'm so sorry, I thought you were my boyfriend. But at the same time, this voice in my head is saying, oh my god, that bird had his arm around you, and he knew you weren't his girlfriend. So I'm being polite and stuff, but at the same time, I'm beyond
Ally
annoyed.
has been slain.
The guy just started smiling and saying, sit back down and all this, and by that point I'm struggling not to call him a creep and just slap him one, but I'm gonna go sit back with my boyfriend and tell him what happened. At first he's just laughing like it's the funniest thing ever, and people in the theater are just looking over, telling us to shush and all that, even though we're trying to be dead quiet. But when I whisper in his ear what the guy had done,
You
my
can't take the
ex
desert.
was fuming. And what makes it worse is that the other guy was there with his friends and started carrying on with his, oh, come back here, love. Come have a little cuddle, and all this. My ex tells him to shut it. Someone else threatens to tell the manager and have us thrown out.
They
So
stuck up
everyone
Leslie.
goes quiet for a bit. In the end, we thought it was just best to leave before they could try and start a fight with us at the end or whatever. So, before the film ended, we got up and walked out, just glad to avoid any conflict, really. My boyfriend was raging, but I knew that it just wasn't worth our time. But then as we're in the parking lot of the movie theaters, I turn around, and as I'm getting in the car, guess who's walking across the parking lot towards us? Same 3 guys that I sat next to by accident, and they're headed straight for us.
An enemy has been
My ex
slain.
wanted to scrap with them at first, but I told him they'll probably end up just kicking both our heads in, and then they'll just smash the car. So, get in the car, and let's just leave. We did exactly that, and thank God my ex saw sense in that moment, but even as we drove out of the parking lot, they started actually following us. And the way it was set up was that we had to
Shut down.
come back on ourselves to get out, so we basically had to drive right past them to leave. I swear my ex went around one turn doing 45 just to put some distance between us. And they'd have definitely probably knocked a window out or something if they caught up with us. I gotta admit, it was incredibly scary towards the end. And I really have to admit that I did think that they were going to do us some damage, perhaps even just to the car. But honestly, it never ceases to amaze me how scummy some guys can be and just think they can get away with it.
Has destroyed a turret.
Dull blade.
Believe it or not, the scariest moment of my life occurred because of my best friend. Before I get to that story, let me give you some context. I became fast friends with a girl named Abigail when we were both freshmen in high school. We were inseparable. For all 4 years of high school, we did absolutely everything together. Every weekend she was at my house or I was at hers. During the summer, we would alternate between our houses, never going more than a day without seeing each other. Our parents eventually gave up trying to get us to do anything apart and even let us tag along on each other's family vacations. Over the course of our friendship, I learned that Abigail had a major flaw. She was insanely, competitively jealous. This wasn't your run-of-the-mill jealousy. She would get crazy jealous if I got a cute boyfriend.
Your
The
turret
key word,
has been destroyed.
cute. If I dated a guy she didn't think was attractive, she wouldn't get jealous at all. Her jealousy would manifest in getting angry at me for spending any time without her. As we got older, her jealousy made her extremely competitive with me over guys. If I met a cute boy, she would swoop in and try to steal his attention.
Ally has been slain.
Abby, as I called her, was gorgeous. She had jet black, naturally curly hair that fell down her back in perfect ringlets, and the biggest blue eyes I'd ever seen. She also had curves and a gorgeous smile. I, on the other hand, was insecure inside and out. I was by no means shy, but I never considered myself to be as attractive as Abby. I was kind of chunky and dressed modestly because I hated the way men stared at my chest. For me, it was no competition. Abby was the prettiest.
Feeling if they're dead.
When guys would hit on her, I just thought, that makes sense because she is gorgeous and
An
is good
ally
at
has
flirting.
been slain.
I didn't have enough confidence to flirt. I had a huge personality that I hid behind and thought all of my guy friends were just that, friends. Because of this, I naively allowed Abby to bat her lashes and swoop in on guys I was into. Looking back, it's obvious that these guys gave Abby attention because they knew she would put out, but I digress. But onto the story here. It was the end of our senior year in 2007. Abby and I had been the youngest employees at a fancy restaurant for the previous 3 years, so several of our coworkers were slightly older than us, surprised us with a hotel party the night of graduation. By the time midnight rolled around, there were at least 50 people in our hotel suite. A little before midnight, a group of 4 guys joined the party who were friends of friends. Being young and naive, I remember thinking, the more the merrier, instead of, who are these people?
Loyalty is an art.
As soon as these guys entered and started mingling, I noticed how cute one of them was. I didn't say anything to Abigail since I knew how she was. I'd let her pick who she thought was the cutest and avoid her competing with me for attention the rest of the night. Maybe a half hour after the guys arrived, I was standing near the balcony doing shots with a few others when one of my favorite songs started playing. Being the hippie I am, I started dancing by myself. Suddenly someone took my hand and began twirling me around. I soon realized it was the guy from the group that I thought was cute. Andy King. We twirled around until the song was over and then he introduced himself. I'm Dylan. You got some moves, girl. Thanks. I'm B. B was, and what everyone calls me. How did you hear about our party? Jay,
Your turret has
he
been
responded.
destroyed.
Jay was one of our coworkers at the restaurant who was throwing us this party, so I stupidly assumed that if Jay had invited Dylan, he must have been an alright guy. An assumption I would soon regret.
You can't tame the desert.
Dylan and I stood around talking for about 10 minutes when Abby approached us. If you want to dance with someone who can show you a thing or two, save the next one for me, Abby said to Dylan, practically knocking me out of the way. Is that a challenge?
I've got value.
It's a guarantee, mister,
They stack up nicely.
Abby said as she ran her finger down his chest and abdomen. I had had enough. Abby always got what she wanted, so I knew I didn't stand a chance. I turned to leave the two of them to it, but someone grabbed my hand and stopped me. Where are you going? It was Dylan. I looked from Dylan to Abby, who was glaring daggers at me. For a refill, I spluttered. I could use one too. Dylan beamed at me. What about my dance? Abby whined. I'm not really in the mood for a dance lesson, Missy,
Everyone has a price.
he had told her, adding a snarl in the last word. He was still holding my hand, so he guided me toward the bar on the other side of the room. As we were getting our drinks, I glanced over to where we had been standing, and Abby was still standing in the same spot with her mouth open. As soon as she noticed me, she gave me a look that sent shivers down my spine. I remember thinking, great, now I've done it. She's probably going to be terrible with me for the rest of the night. As a show of peace, I made Abby her favorite shot and brought it to her. She took it from me, downed it, and walked away without saying a word. Whatever, I thought. I tried. A little while later, several people, including Dylan and the guys he was with, were trying to convince everyone to go to a club that had just opened up about a mile from the hotel. At this point, I was well on my way to getting drunk for only the second time in my life. I was happy keeping the hotel party going, and to my surprise, so was Abby and about a dozen other people. Our party split, with the majority of the attendees going to the club and the rest staying at the hotel. At that point, it was about 1 in the morning. Abby started being nice to me again, so I celebrated by doing more shots. We continued drinking for the next couple of hours. Everyone was pretty hammered, but we were all getting along, dancing, smoking, and just having a general good time. Around 3 a.m., some of the partygoers who had gone to the club returned to our hotel room to finish out the night. This included Dylan. Over about 20 minutes, our party regrew from about a dozen to somewhere around 30 people. To be completely honest, I don't remember a ton from about 1:30 to 3:30. As I mentioned before, I was drunk for only the second time, and I was trashed. This is the first time I had ever truly let myself loose. What gets fuzzy in my memory, other more sober attendees filled in the gaps for me. However, this next part I can remember in vivid detail. Around 3:30, I was going to the bathroom, alone because I'm not one of those females. All I remember is washing my hands, and suddenly, there was someone behind me, grinding hard up against me. In my drunken state, I was confused at first because I thought I had locked the door and wondered how one of my friends got in. I finally clued in that it wasn't one of my drunk friends messing with me. It was a guy. In fact, it was Dylan. "Finally, I've been dying to get you alone all night," Dylan slurred, clearly way more drunk than before the club. "What are you doing it?" I'm cut off by Dylan spinning me around and sticking his tongue down my throat. I shoved him away to get free of his grasp, and he just clung to me harder. I tried to yell, but he swiftly covered my mouth and got both of us to the floor before I knew what was happening. I bit his hand as hard as I could. When he recoiled, I used my legs to kick him off of me. But I couldn't get out because my kick landed him up against the door, and this enraged him. Dylan balled up his fists, and this predatory grin spread across his face as he said, "I always love a fighter." The next thing I knew, we both crashed into the bathtub, and my eyes hurt really bad. But I keep thinking, just kick, bite, claw, and punch anything you come in contact with. I do just that and somehow become free of him in the tub. Just as I'm about to grab the door handle and make my escape, he grabs me from behind and I scream for the first time. I don't know how or why it took me so long to find my voice, but I did get out a loud scream before he had covered my mouth again. Suddenly the bathroom door opens and in walks Abigail. Dylan immediately lets go of me and tells Abby we were just messing around. She tells him that Jay wants to leave soon, so he better get out of there if he wants to ride with him. Dylan casually strolls out of the bathroom, and Abby shuts the door behind him. As soon as the door closed, I burst into tears. My clothes are torn, there's blood running out of my mouth from where I bit him, and my eyes rapidly swelling. I was sitting on the edge of the bathtub, and Abby knelt in front of me. "Did he do this to you?" she asked me. "Yes," I managed to get out between sobs. "Don't worry, B. I'll handle everything. You just stay in here, and I'll take care of Dylan, okay?" I nodded my head, and Abby left the bathroom. I moved to the floor and leaned up against the bathtub, then heard shouting in our room and a lot of scuffling. I assumed Abby was handling everything as she had promised. I buried my head in my lap and waited for Abby to come tell me everything was okay and Dylan was gone. I looked up because I heard the door open and was paralyzed with fear. Dylan was standing in front of me. He locked the bathroom door, turned to look at me, and said 7 words that haunt me to this day.
Minions have spawned.
Abby said you needed me in here.
Get
I was
paid
terrified
get
and
out.
heartbroken at the same time. Abby said I needed him? Oh my god. She sent him back in here? My best friend sent a predator back into the bathroom with me because she was jealous. She chose to send my attacker back in for another round as payback for him not being into her. Dylan then reached down and grabbed my ankle, yanking me across the floor and beneath him.
Another fight,
I
another
remember thinking, this can't be how it ends. I'm not about to be a victim. If this monster's gonna try to take what he wants, I'm not about to make it easy. I then had an idea, and I relaxed beneath him. I made him think I had given up fighting him off. He was ripping my clothes the rest of the way off when I saw my opportunity and kicked him in the face as hard as I could. Once again, Dylan's body was blocking the door, so I ripped the hairdryer out of the wall and began beating the life out of him. As he shielded himself away from my blows, he writhed away from the door enough that I could slip out. To my shock, our hotel room was empty. Not a single person, not even my best friend Abby, was there. I would find out later that when Abby left the bathroom to go handle everything, she told everyone the cops were there. Naturally, everyone bounced. I panicked. I grabbed my purse from the closet and ran out of the room. I was barefoot, in my underwear and a ripped tank top, had an eye that was swollen shut, and more alcohol in my system than I had ever consumed before or since. From this moment on, my memory gets fuzzy again. The last thing I remember clearly is running from the hotel room. I don't remember anything from my drive home. I lived about 30 minutes away from the hotel, and by some miracle, I made it home in one piece. Not a smart idea. I woke up the next day black and blue all over. Everything was sore and bruised. The first person I called was Jay, my coworker who threw the party and had invited Dylan. I asked him how well he knew Dylan, and he said he went to high school with him and that they were hangout friends, meaning he has partied with him a lot, but they aren't super close. I then told Jay what happened. He was appalled and assured me he had no idea Dylan was like that. He kept apologizing for inviting him, but then started making excuses for him. Jay said when Dylan came back from the club, it was the most messed up he had ever seen him. He said, I know my boy likes to party, but I've never seen him be that torn up. He must have done some heavy stuff at the club, I swear. Well, I don't care what he did at the club. He assaulted me. I snapped back at Jay. Jay kept making excuses, so I just ended the call. I took a shower and replayed the night's events in my head. Why didn't I make sure the door was locked? Why did I drink so much? How could Abigail do such a horrible thing to me? She's supposed to be my best friend. I called my other friend and coworker Jamie, who had helped Jay throw us the party. Jamie tells me that she's also known Jay for years, and there's no way he was in his right mind if he did what I claimed. If he did it? I realized in that moment that if my friends were having a hard time believing my story, law enforcement definitely wouldn't believe me. So, I covered up my bruises, made up an excuse for my parents about my black eye, and went radio silent for a week. Word spread about Dylan. I didn't answer any calls or texts, but I kept my phone on. I continuously received messages from friends saying Dylan was a good guy, and I should hear his side of the story. Clearly, one of these friends gave Dylan my number because he started texting me. At first, he was begging me to forgive him. He claimed to have done a ton of coke at the club and had no recollection of what happened in the bathroom. He said he woke up and went to the hospital because someone had beaten him up. When I didn't respond, he started threatening me, saying things like, Jay told me you were the one who caused me to get 15 stitches in my face and head. I'm not getting kicked off the football team because you say I assaulted you. I'm the one with stitches. I never responded to any of these messages. After 5 days, Abigail finally called me. We hadn't gone 5 days without speaking in 4 years. Before I could stop myself, I answered the phone without saying a word. Abby says, B, we're headed to the lake. Pick you up on the way? I didn't say anything. Hello? B, are you coming or not? She pressed. No. I responded and hung up. And that was the last time I ever spoke to Abigail. I decided not to press charges based on the excuse that I was about to move away for college in less than 2 months. Because I was young and naive, I also convinced myself that everyone makes mistakes. Maybe Dylan was a good guy who just made a horrible mistake. The weekend before I left for college would reveal just how wrong that assumption was. 8 weeks later, I was enjoying my last weekend of summer at home with family. The next week I would be moving over 300 miles away for university. Some of my friends invited me to an after-dark pool party. I decided to go since this would be the last chance I would have to see them before leaving. I rode to the party with my friend Ashley. We were there for about an hour when Ashley tells me she just saw Dylan when she went inside to use the bathroom. I immediately froze in place. Ashley tells me to stay outside, and she will grab her purse and keys from the house and we will leave. As I'm waiting on her to return, someone comes up behind me and grabs my hips while whispering in my ear, "Are you gonna let me finish what we started last time?" Dylan. Instantly, I had confirmation of his character. He really was a predator. He showed me his true self when I first encountered him at the hotel party. He knew exactly what he was doing then and meant to assault me. Now, this piece of garbage was taunting me over it. He was relishing in the fact that he had gotten away with it. Now, I am not one to fear making a scene when I'm uneasy or feel threatened, so I screamed. "Didn't I give you enough stitches last time? Stay away from me." And my sudden outburst caused everyone to look in our direction. Dylan threw his hands up and backed away from me.
Take my toll.
At that moment, Ashley returned with her keys and we just bolted. I never saw Dylan again after that. If there's anything I want people to take from this, it's that 1. You can be in an abusive friendship. Friendships are just platonic relationships and you deserve friends who have your back no matter what. 2. Never assume that friends of friends can be trusted. Trusted loved ones as well as strangers can and will take advantage of you if you let them. The story happened sometime in the mid-1980s when my mom was a teenager in high school. My mother and my aunt grew up on a farm in Central Florida that was relatively in the middle of nowhere at the time. We still live in this area and it's more urbanized now, but at this point in time it was mostly woods and farmland. My great aunt, uncle, and our cousins lived on the same property in another house, however, so they weren't entirely alone. But outside of that, you'd have to drive a mile, or maybe a little less than that or so before you reach their next neighbor. My grandfather coached for the local high school football team and my mother and aunt were cheerleaders. So on Friday he would have to coach at the school's game and my mom and aunt would be there to cheerlead. The rest of the family would usually come along as well since my cousins went to the school too and there really wasn't anything else to do in that small town on a Friday night. They would usually get to the game earlier than everyone else considering that he was a coach. One particular Friday, however, my mother started feeling very sick throughout the day, and by the time the evening rolled around, she felt horrible. She informed my grandfather that she wasn't really feeling up to going and that she would be staying home to rest. My grandma made her something to eat for dinner, and after that, the whole family, including my great aunt and great uncle, went on their way. She was alone on their property. For some context, we eventually ended up selling this property when I was a young child, so I don't have a ton of memories about my grandparents' property. One thing I can remember was that it could get very creepy at night in the evening time, and this was with other people there, so being alone on it at night must have been a lot more frightening. Anyways, my mom went to lay down right after they left, but not long after, maybe 5 or 10 minutes, she realizes she needed to call her cheerleading coach at school to let her know that she wasn't going to be there tonight so that she could be prepared for her absence. Keep in mind, this is the mid-80s, so there's no cell phones. My mom has to get up and walk all the way to the kitchen to use the phone.
Welcome to Summoner's
As she
Rift.
is walking through the house, she starts to feel a bit creeped out. Like that classic feeling of something not being right. That instinctual feeling we
30
get when
seconds until
something is
minions
just telling
spawn.
us that we're in a potentially bad situation and may not even know it yet. Outside, it's getting dark out and there are not many lights on in the house, which contribute to this uneasy feeling. Very important detail. The phone in my grandparents' house has a longer cord than most phones at the time. She says that you could walk into other rooms and the cord was long enough that the phone could be brought out of the kitchen into the neighboring rooms, which are the living room, the hallway, and my grandparents' bedroom. In the hallway by the kitchen and by my grandparents' bedroom, my grandfather kept a shotgun on the wall,
You
fully
can't
loaded
tame
and
the
ready to
desert.
go. Not the safest thing, I guess, but when you live alone in the woods, I guess you want to be ready to defend yourself the second you know you're in trouble. He'd always told my mom and aunt, do not touch that shotgun unless your life is in danger. She took this very seriously and had never thought about touching the gun. By this point, she was in the kitchen. She dialed the number to call her coach and informed her about her illness. I believe they continued talking for a minute or so because she says that the coach was still on the phone and my mom heard strange noises coming from my grandparents' room. My mother, very frightened, told the coach she heard something and grabbed the shotgun off the wall, phone still pressed to her ear. She wasn't sure if she was overreacting and had imagined something, but she opened the door to my grandparents' room, and what she saw made her drop the phone right on the floor in shock. The window was completely open, and there was a large man with one leg over the windowsill and one leg still outside. What was so awkward about this was he had basically stopped in the middle of coming in when he realized he had been caught by her, as if he was not expecting someone to be home, but that he simply did not expect her to have heard him coming in. They just stared at each other for a good 5 seconds, him just halfway in the room, and her just standing in the doorway, phone on the floor with my mom's coach still on the line asking if she was okay, shotgun in hand, staring at each other, both almost unsure what to do. My mom, terribly frightened, finally mustered up the will to speak first. In a very shy and afraid voice, she managed, I have a gun. Turn around and leave or I'll shoot. The man just stood there. She said it was as if he was wondering whether she was bluffing or not. Finally, after what seemed like hours to her, just staring, he suddenly swung his other leg in very fast and
I'll
turned
fight
quickly
for a
like he was about to
cause.
charge
I
her.
won't die for one.
My mother, terrified, with her hands shaking, fired the shotgun and hit him in the shoulder. The impact was so much that it knocked her back on the floor and sent the man directly out of the window he had come in. Blood was everywhere around the window. She picked the phone back up, now sobbing, telling her coach to call the police to her house. When she looked back, she saw the man running, clutching his shoulder, bleeding out all over their yard, running back to the woods behind their property. Keep in mind, he had just been shot in the shoulder with a shotgun.
Ally has
It's
been
not like it was a
slain.
handgun or something. This dude had basically just immediately gotten up like it was nothing and started hauling off from the woods. I don't know the exact order of what happened next, but the police eventually did get there. My grandparents hurried home sometime shortly after, and the police were still there. I think what was most weird about this story was that there was a trail of blood that the guy had left as he was fleeing the property that went out into the woods. The police investigated and found that it continued for some ways into the forest and eventually just stopped. There was no body or anything, like the blood just stopped. They never caught up with the guy. I think it's bizarre because she had shot him in his upper torso with a shotgun, and around the window in the room looked like a scene of a horror movie. There was so much blood. How he got away, apparently alive, and so quickly without the cops catching up, is quite odd.
Laws or whatever works at the time.
This happened 4 years ago. I'm a girl, and at the time this happened, I was 12 going on 13 in just a month or two.
An ally has been
The friend I mentioned in the story was 14 at the time. The friend, Sally, who I was staying with that night, 14-year-old female, was quite a bit older than me. At least, at the time, the 2-year age gap was quite big. At 12 to 13 years old, I was about to start my second year of middle school, whereas Sally should have been about to begin her sophomore year of high school. I met her in the beginning of my first year at a new school. She was older than the other kids in our grade and was considered one of the popular kids, and I think that's what drew me to her at first. We quickly became friends, and before we knew it, we were spending every single weekend together. Seriously, every single weekend. Nothing seemed to be out of the ordinary. It was your typical Friday night. We carpooled to our family's apartment after school. I've always been a picky eater, so when her family had dinner, I didn't eat with them. I just snacked on the Pop-Tart that I'd stowed away in my backpack in case they ordered something that I wouldn't eat. Something to note is that her family was pretty religious. I wouldn't go as far as to say that they were fanatics, but they didn't allow their kids to watch horror movies or anything that was rated PG-13 or older. It didn't stem from the desire to protect them from something inappropriate.
My kind of
Sally's
bird.
mother had an irrational fear that scary movies had satanic messages. We asked to watch The Purge, and her mom obviously said no. After some negotiating, she agreed to let us watch Hunger Games instead. After the movie, Sally and I went to hang out in her room.
Loyalty isn't
She put on some music, and being the age we were, we gave each other makeovers. By the end of it, we were looking much older than just 12 and 14. This part of the night is when things started to seem off to me. Sally wasn't the most positive influence. Despite being my best friend at the time, she was manipulative and got off on putting me down. She had a habit of talking to men online and lying about her age. Sally showed me some texts between her and the man she was talking to. I can't give you an exact recount of them, but they consisted of him trying to convince her to meet up with him and just the usual things you'd expect from a creep online. According to him, he was 19, tall, and blonde with soulful blue eyes. Once I saw the text, I asked if she had a picture of him. Something didn't sit right with me after seeing the messages. She showed me what he looked like, and he was very clearly not 19. This man was at least 40 and looked like he lived in his mother's basement. Then, we got a call from her. Sally answered without hesitation, and when I heard the voice on the other end of the call, I felt like I was going to be sick. "You're so pretty. Why don't you come meet me?" He asked. Sally said that she couldn't because she was spending the night with a friend. The mention of that sparked his interest, and then he proceeded to try and ask us both to meet him. Sally, lacking any common sense, said yes. Thus begun her plan for us to sneak out and walk 15 blocks to meet him in a deserted McDonald's parking lot. I didn't want to go. I was raised on stories of what happens to teen girls who meet random men from the internet in person. But after adamant pleading from Sally that she didn't feel safe going by herself, I agreed. We took our phones with us for the walk. I had a kitchen knife stuffed in my bra in case something were to happen and I needed to defend myself. The route we had to take to get there didn't have very many street lamps, and there weren't any houses. We were surrounded by trees on both sides of us. When we got to the parking lot, the only car parked nearby was a black beat-up 2000 Toyota Corolla. The car was still running when we got there, and from what we could tell, there was more than one person inside. The man from the picture got out of the front passenger seat and left the door open behind him before approaching us. I turned my flash on so I could see, and he was obviously on something. I can't tell you what kind of drug it was for the life of me, but his eyes were so wide that it looked like they were about to pop out of his
They
head.
stack up nicely.
He was jittery and kept twitching. I became very conscious of how big he was. He was 6'2", around 280 pounds. For reference, my friend and I did not look our ages, even without makeup. I'm about 5'2". My friend was pretty tall, probably around 5'6" to 5'7", and we were both significantly smaller than him. The man reached out for us and caught my friend by the arm. I went to get my knife as quickly as I could, and that's when I saw his friends getting out of the car. He invited us back to his car and offered us booze and drugs. But after seeing my knife and that I was ready to call the police, he released my friend. I took Sally's arm and ran faster than I ever had in my entire life. We took the long way home to avoid them finding out where she lived in case they were following us. Once we got there, her family was still sound asleep. We locked all the doors, closed the blinds, and blocked them on everything. There wouldn't be any sleeping that night. We were constantly peeking out the window, and to our dismay, that same Toyota was circling around her apartment building. Not once, not twice, but at least 3 times. I never mentioned any of this to my parents out of fear of getting grounded or in trouble. I'm 16 now and they still have no clue. I still get nervous when I see a car similar to the one from that night. As for Sally, her parents never found out either. We agreed never to speak about it again. Thankfully, she moved into a new house just a few weeks after that happened. Safe to say, Sally and I haven't spoken in 3 years. She was angry at me for ruining her night, as she put it, and our friendship didn't last long after that. We had a pretty bad falling out, but looking back on it now was definitely for the better. And that was definitely the last night I ever snuck out. When I was in high school, I worked part-time at a Taekwondo studio teaching kids classes. Taekwondo was a big part of my life. My dad was Korean and was adamant about starting me young. So when I was 6 years old, I got pushed into the realm of martial arts. And I loved it. I got my black belt at age 9, and I even competed on an international scale. So when my coach asked me if I wanted to work part-time to get some extra cash and help with our lack of staff, I didn't waste a second to agree. Now, because age is regarded differently in South Korea, I started American high school at 13, just a little younger than most kids. And there were even a few more my age. So it wasn't shocking in itself, but I was pretty small compared to most kids my age, so a lot of teachers and other adults thought I wasn't supposed to be there. Point being, I was very obviously a child. Now, I was also in a high school sports team that also required practice, so throughout high school my schedule looked like this. Mom would drive me to school at 6 a.m. for practice. I'd stay in practice after school until about 4:30 and walk to get the 4:45 bus to my studio. I believe it was my sophomore year when I was 14. I left school to make the bus per usual when I noticed the car driving really slow around campus. I went to a pretty big school, so I figured it was just a parent looking for their kid. That was until I got to the bus stop and noticed the car circling the block my stop was on. I've gotten catcalled before, honked at, etc., so while it did put me on edge and disgust me considering I looked like I was 11, it wasn't totally new to me. What was new, however, this dude pulling up to the curb and stopping his car in the bus lane. Luckily, this was a busy intersection near a school and rush hour traffic, so at least he had the common sense not to get out of his ratty old Volvo. Too many witnesses, I guess. At this point, I was on the phone with my sister speaking in Korean as to not let this man know that I was giving her a description of him, his car, the street, and his plate number. My sister knew something was up when I started speaking Korean because we almost always speak English at home unless we're talking to or with our dad. Mom was born in America, so she speaks English. But this ignorant SOB hits me with ni hao. And I wish I could say that was the cringiest thing, but this wouldn't be much of a story if it was. You Asian girls are so cute. Kawaii, you know? When I wasn't giving a reaction, this idiot proceeds to move into the passenger seat and stick his head out the window. You kawaii. You so kawaii. In the slowest, loudest, most obnoxious voice that made me want to run into oncoming traffic. And then he picks up his phone. He dials a number and waits for someone to pick up. Hey man, I'm over here. There's this cute little Asian thing in the corner. I don't know, Japanese, Chinese, one of those Oriental
The
folk.
only thing I look
Speaks
up to
no
is the
English.
sky.
She's real tiny. 110 soaking wet, sitting at the bus stop. Yeah? For sure. Alright, see you later, brother. I don't know if it was the ignorance, the creepiness, or the fact that this 40-something-year-old white guy with a beer belly and a musty old Volvo was trying to sound like a teenager. But I wanted to drop-kick this man off a cliff. But alas, my bus came and I practically flew on and sighed in relief as he drove away when the bus pulled up. But of course, that wasn't enough for him. You'd think that after how cute he said that I was looking would be enough, but no. That ratty old car drove behind my bus for 20 minutes until my stop. Luckily, I got off the phone with my sister and had already called my coach and boss to let him know what was up. He was like another father to me, and I knew he was livid. He sent on his son, who we'll call B, who was 16 and but an absolute unit.
I've got value.
If I hadn't grown up with him, I'd be scared too. This kid was 6'2", 180 pounds, and was so ripped, he looked like he ate raw chicken for breakfast. When my bus pulled up and I saw him standing across the street, I just sobbed out of relief. But of course, Creeper 2.0 had stopped behind the bus, jumped out of his car as soon as my bus came to a stop. B saw the dude and booked across the crosswalk to meet me. And this dude cowered like a stray puppy. In a matter of seconds, this man was back in his creeper mobile and sped off so fast I could actually smell the bus rubber. B walked with me down to the studio and into the staff room where I cried with him and his dad for like 30 minutes, and then called the non-emergency line to give all the information I had. From then on, B met me at the bus stop every day before work, and when he got his license, he would just pick me up from school himself. We actually started dating about a half a year later and are still going strong. So, creepy old Volvo dude, thanks for helping me meet the love of my life. But I hope you get in a crash with a semi-truck.
Honor is the rust on a dull blade.
So do y'all remember when Popeye's chicken sandwich was at its peak and someone actually shot someone over a sandwich? Well, I got a story similar, just instead of taking a life, it saved mine. Let me start by saying this is all 100% true. With some quick Google searches, you can find all the details of this story within the story, but this is my side. At the time I was going through a rough patch. I wasn't really working. I had my own florist shop, if you know what I mean. I was sleeping late, barely paying bills. You know, the same sob story. I also, because I didn't have much extra cash at the time, hadn't had the Popeye's chicken sandwich yet. This will be very important to the story. Life-changing, actually. I woke up just like any other day, smoked a bowl, shower, ate a little breakfast, and played some video games, hoping my phone would ring, and soon around mid-noon I would have a few good sales lined up. So off to town I drove. I turned out of my gate, headed north down Highway 76 in Wilson, Oklahoma. If that sounds familiar, it's because it is. If you heard the story of Molly Miller and Cole Haynes, Highway 76 in Wilson, Oklahoma is where they went missing. When we bought this property, the FBI or someone actually came to excavate for their bodies on our property. Their crosses are on the corner of my property and we're there when we bought it. There's lots of stories about this area, and everything you've heard is true. Now back to the main story. With a little extra cash in my pocket around the time, one of my friends calls me and asks me if I wanted to hang out with them at another friend's, aka smoke a lot of weed. I say I'm down, and after picking him up in a 15-minute drive across town, we're rolling blunts, passing them around, laughing and coughing like it's a ghetto track meet, and telling stories that, surprisingly, you wouldn't believe. An eighth or so later, and a few stories past, it's getting closer to dinner time and for everyone to start heading back home and getting ready for the next day, including the blue-collar 9-to-5 workers. My friend mentions he hadn't had the Popeye's chicken sandwich either, and after a quick, what's better with weed than a fried chicken sandwich? Nothing conversation, we're off to get and eat our sandwiches. And man, they're good. I don't know if I'd kill someone they're so good, but between you and I, me being a former Chick-fil-A employee, Popeye's sandwiches are better. No, I eat like a starving baby hyena, and my friend had the munchies, so 10 to 15 minutes later we're done, and I've dropped him off. I'm driving home on Highway 32 in Lone Grove doing about 55, speeding up 65 miles per hour when I get past a cop with his sirens on like I'm a stranded turtle. I think to myself, I haven't seen anyone, so that's a little excessive, huh? About 5 miles later, I'm in the 65 area of Highway 32. I drive a little faster and I'm doing 75 when another cop again passes me like his life is on the line. Little did I know I would soon find out it wasn't his life. I drive through Wilson and turn down Highway 76. It's overcast by this time and starting to drizzle a little. Again, I have to restate that I'm not just setting the mood. This is all 100% true, as painful as it is for me to say. And after looking at the facts, it's very painful. I'm about a half mile from my driveway, if that, when I crest a hill and I see more cops than a Fast and Furious movie. I slow down and the first thing I think of is my parents. They were out driving, so I called them and everything's all good.
I've got values.
I take a back way home and being whatever happened was directly in front of our friend's property, we call them to see. Did they know any details, and what they told us was gut-wrenching. About 10 to 15 minutes prior, the same 10 to 15 minutes I was eating my chicken sandwich, that put me not directly following one of our further down neighbors, Kent maybe his name was, and the other person involved. They were driving home after the workday, Kent being maybe 3 miles, the other woman driving maybe 10 seconds from turning her blinker on to enter her highway after following each other when an 18-wheeler coming the opposite direction crosses the center lane, side-flipping Kent and colliding head-on with the woman. There wasn't much left, Kent said, on his truck. However, for the woman, there wasn't much left of the entire front end of her Chevy Equinox SUV. The car isn't at fault here. Every airbag, crush point, and support did what it was supposed to and capable of. You just don't realize how big an 18-wheeler is until you see the damage it does to another car.
And get out.
Miraculously, though, the woman was still breathing. A care flight was called and she was rushed to a hospital where she would fight for her life but ultimately lose the battle. She left behind a husband, a daughter, my niece played with her a lot at school when they still lived in the area, and a son, the daughter and son of which would have been coming home with their mother that fateful day had their dad not got off early and picked them up early from school. It's not a scary story, but it's truly chilling when you think that a decision to stop for a chicken sandwich is the exact 10 minutes I needed to be writing this today.
Killing spree.
When I was 17 years old in 2005, I lived in a quiet village where nothing ever happened. At least, that's what we thought. I had just gotten my license and I was excited to meet up with my older boyfriend in the city on the weekend. It was the first time I was able to drive my car alone since getting my license, so the occasion was a celebration of sorts. I live in Wisconsin, so the distance between nowhere land and city isn't a great distance, 40 miles to Milwaukee. The highway to the major cities is a hop, skip, and a jump. Shortly after leaving the village, I noticed a white car on the side of the road, which wouldn't be uncommon for the area except for it being in summer. During winter here, it's always a common courtesy to stop and see if they need help, but since it wasn't danger season, I normally wouldn't think twice about it. However, there was an 8-ish-year-old boy walking away from the car. We were at least a mile away from civilization behind me, 14 miles to the nearest city, and I stopped to see what I could do to help. I had expected that he was with a grandparent that couldn't walk that sort of distance back to town for help. This was in a time when having a cell phone wasn't that common yet, when the young and the old being 2005. I pulled over next to the boy and asked him what was going on. He told me he was on the way to the only car repair shop in town, which was at least 3 miles away from where we were. I said that was a very long way off to walk, and I offered him a ride.
Shut down.
He was hesitant, and I told him I'm a student at the high school a mile away. I wouldn't let him hold my cell phone, and my ID, and until we got there, if he ever felt afraid, he could easily dial 911 without me being able to stop him. And we were only a 3-minute drive from where he was going. I said we should talk to the person in the car first, and the boy seemed to panic. First red flag. No, it's fine, just go. I was like, okay?
You've got a problem.
I was just a kid myself, and my local address was clearly on my ID. He looked at my ID for a minute and got into the car. He seemed at ease with holding my phone and my ID. This is a time before you could dial 911 without a passcode. I gave him my passcode, and he seemed at ease when he could get into my phone. I told him not to check my boyfriend's messages because he was too young, lol. With the times and neighborhood we were around, that was reasonable to me. I didn't suspect anything. Then the car that was pulled over that couldn't move suddenly screeched out of its spot and raced after me with its blinkers on, insisting that I pull over. I looked over to the kid in the passenger seat with my eyeball raised. Again, the child was about 8 years old. He just shook with fear next to me. The man in the car pulled over behind me, got out, and slammed his car door behind him in a rage as he strutted up to my window. This was odd to me since they were supposed to be broken down, and the kid looked extremely afraid. When he walked up, I rolled my window down enough so I could hear him, and he told me he was a social worker and the child I had picked up was a danger to himself and others, and I was in danger sitting next to him while driving. He could have killed me. I was afraid because I hadn't expected a broken down car to chase me, and I wasn't having a hard time believing what he was saying. I turned to this boy next to me after I rolled up the window in this guy's face. I said, "Do you know this man? Is what he's saying true?"
The only thing
I'm really sorry. I'm pretty scared right now. The fear in my eyes, I think the kid misunderstood. I wasn't afraid of him. I was afraid of the man outside my window. The boy said no. I think he was trying to protect me too. The situation wasn't sitting with me. Something seemed really off, and with how aggressive the man outside my window was, I really was afraid. He looked like he would have hit me if I had rolled the window down far enough. The kid said no, he'd be okay. Got out of my car and went with him. The look of dread on his face haunts my dreams to this day. It still didn't sit well with me that he got into the man's car and they drove away towards the city. I called my date and told him I would be very late, and went to the school as fast as my car could take me with a license plate in mind. I talked to the liaison officer at my school after I ran into the building screaming his name like a banshee. I told him about the kid, and he said before I had even gotten there, someone had dialed 911 about me stopping to pick up the kid, and they were apprehended just as I got to the school. The caller was suspicious of me too, which scared my liaison officer. I was the school's biggest goody two-shoes, despite being the only goth. I gave my statement right there. I was told to never stop for a child again unless I were to ever be suspected of abduction, and he said I was still in the wrong. I shouldn't have gotten involved. What if the man had a gun? But the man in the car went to jail, and the boy was brought safely back home. He couldn't give me any details from the case, but since the man was apprehended and questioned, and the boy was brought home, that's all I ever was told. I'm not sure what crime I stopped that day, but that day I know I saved that boy from certain unknown abuse, and I'm just glad that I stopped to help.
Has been slain. Shut down. Ally has been slain.
About 7 years ago, my husband and I were living with his parents. His mother didn't work, so essentially we were there helping his dad pay bills that his mom and her friends, aka neighborhood tweakers, would rack up. His mother was friends with a couple, let's call them Debbie and Dave, who lived in an RV with their young son, and she agreed that for $100 they could park in front of our house and use electric and water. They were kind of odd, but nice for the most part.
Kings come and go.
They'd never really been
Gold
creepy, and
stays.
I'd never been alone with either Debbie or Dave before this. Usually I would just exchange small pleasantries in passing on my way to or from work or school. Not a big deal. Anyways, Summer rolls around and I had a bit more free time during the day, which
Well,
meant I was
it's
hanging
my
around
kind
at
of
home more
burden.
often. We had a big patio in the back and a nice setup with a table, chairs, and outdoor bar. I made a habit of heading out there in the mornings to drink my coffee and smoke a bowl. It was quiet and I enjoyed not having to deal with everyone else. This morning seemed off though. When I got up to get coffee at around 8 a.m., the front door was wide open. Weird, but we had a lot of people in and out, so I figured someone came and left and forgot to shut it. So I shut it on my way to get coffee and go out back. I finished my coffee and smoke and head back inside to get a second cup of coffee, and the door again is open. I start to shut it again when I hear someone yelling at me. "Hey, hold on. I need it open." I look out the door and here comes Dave with a huge basket of clothes. "Can you show me how to use your washer?" "Yeah, no problem." So I take Dave to the laundry room and show him how to use our washer-dryer, then try to leave to get my second cup of coffee. I'm halfway out the door when Dave grabs my arm pretty hard and says,
Shut down.
"Wait, where are you going? I need to talk to you." He then goes on to explain he's going to dump Debbie and their son and leave them at her mom's house. And then came the big creepy moment. "You could move into the RV with me if you wanted." I tried to, as nice as I could, let him know that I was married and had no interest in living in an RV. "Oh, married? Aren't you a little young for that?" I was 22 at the time. Now, if that didn't already make me angry and creep me out, the next sentence out of his mouth sure did. "And I'm sorry, but you don't seem that serious about that guy because
It's not
you flirt with me all the time."
An
I
ally has been
didn't.
slain.
I'd barely spoken to this man, let alone flirt with him. Being somewhat nervous and a bit mad at this mid-40s, balding, beer-gutted, jobless, dirty man, I laid into him. I let him know in a now not so nice way that I love my husband. I'd never flirted with him. Thought it was good he was ditching his son with his mom and grandma because then he'd have a way better life. And lastly, the screw off because I wasn't going to live in an RV with anyone, especially not him.
Has destroyed.
Debbie later asked me if I had been rude to her husband. I then let her know the whole story, at which point she also got angry and kicked him out of the RV. I haven't seen Dave since he got kicked out of the RV, and as for Debbie and the son, when the end of the month rolled around, they drove off to Nevada.
Your team has destroyed an inhibitor. An ally has been slain.
I make my own fortune.
This story happened to me a few months ago. I'm a 24-year-old female from a small city that contains a major hospital/clinic where I attended nursing school. Because the parking is next to impossible, I would sleep at my best friend's house before clinicals, which are just like mock nursing ships for students. My friend lives nearly a mile or less from the hospital, so it would be easier to sleep at his house than walk or scooter there if we were around. I had walked there for months with no significant events. Granted, it was around 5 or 6 in the morning and would seldom cross paths with another on the way. One morning, I decided to leave early to get a head start on some of the preparation required. It was around 5 in the morning and I was about to leave while listening to a Let's Read podcast. I had my earbuds in and was trying to get my scooter set up with an app on my phone. Out of nowhere, I started to hear something that sounded like yelling. I took off my earbuds about 100 feet away, and there was a man shouting mostly unintelligible things. The man was very tall, hooded, and dressed in all black. I couldn't make out his face, but he looked unkempt and scruffy. I was only able to make out one of the things he was yelling, which was, "My friend got shot out here." I started back walking because the tone seemed threatening. Then he breaks out into full sprint right at me, and I book it back to my friend's house. He has a Four Seasons porch before you enter the hallway to get inside, and by the time I made it into my friend's door, he was right outside the porch. He was 100 feet away, and it took him about 3 seconds to get that close. As I get inside, I hear more yelling, but I could not make out the words, and then a loud pop, which I can only presume was a gunshot. I was frightened, but mostly like, what just happened? I didn't call the cops because I simply didn't want to have to deal with being late. I've since theorized a couple reasons he would yell that someone was shot. One, he was trying to lure me by saying someone was shot and that he needed help. Two, he was threatening me and implying that you should not be walking alone on these streets. I let my guard down because I had been on that street before and nothing had ever happened, but ever since then, I've had a taser and mace at the ready, with my head on a swivel. This story happened to me around 4 years ago, and when I think of a scary experience, it's this one. I've been listening to this podcast for a while now and decided it was time to share. Around this time I was 7 or 8, I can't quite remember, and I was with my sister a year younger than me. We were going to sports practice and my mother had to run a few errands. If you have never been to a Homes Goods store, it's basically a store with all kinds of things to decorate your house. For instance, furniture, rugs, kitchen utensils, and other sculptures. We had been planning on buying a couch for somewhere in the house, but my sister was being stubborn and wanted to stay in the car. Finally, my mother just went in by herself, leaving us in the car. We had parked our car, with heavily tinted windows, in front of a locksmith shop, which is like a small booth that sold keys. My sister and I became very bored and decided to see how many keys on display we could count, which was fun at the time, I guess. We were sitting in the back of the car and we didn't have cell phones, which will be important later. Then we see this man come to the booth and then another person came out from inside of it. The locksmith who left the booth had a small object in his hand. At the time I couldn't tell exactly what, but now I know that it was probably an electronic lockpick or some other tool. They both shared a few words and pointed to our car. We were both scared and didn't speak, and were even more frightened when they came to the driver's side door, and we heard mechanical clicking sounds echoing through the car. My sister began to scream and my adrenaline fired up. My brain entered autopilot mode as I flicked the lock of my door, setting off the alarm to the locked car. The locksmith and the other man jumped and stepped back, frightened by the alarm. They both jogged over to the booth and shut the door. All the while, I kept flicking the lock of my door to keep the alarm going and trying to comfort my crying sister. The two men ran out of the booth and got in the locksmith van and drove off. I was too shaken to get the license plate number, but eventually my mother came back to the car and would tell her what happened. She didn't call the police, but he didn't get inside the car and there was nothing we could do. Every time we drive by that booth, I can't help but think what would have happened to us if I hadn't been quick to think. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon. Whoever said sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me was a bloody liar. Because the pain I felt when I heard my wife of 15 years tell me, "I don't love you anymore," was astronomical. It was a visceral, physical sensation, one I suppose some people might call heartache, and it was so terrible that I didn't eat or sleep until I finally turned to the bottle to facilitate both. I continued to drink all throughout the divorce, and somewhere along the way, strong painkillers entered the mix. Less than a year later, I was living as a functioning alcoholic in a small apartment, but the deeper I slipped into addiction, the less I was able to remain functioning. In the end, I got sacked from my job for being drunk on duty. I was served an eviction notice, I lost almost everything, and if it wasn't for a last-minute placement in a hostel-based rehab wellness program, I'd have actually been flat out homeless. The hostel was located in this big red brick Victorian building maybe a mile or so outside the city center. Although it wasn't entirely free, the wellness program was subsidized by the city council, so it didn't cost too much per night. It was also run on a completely voluntary basis, meaning you could check out whenever you like, and the staff provided a variety of services and amenities to keep you from relapsing. It seemed the only real downside was that I'd have to share a room with someone. Little did I know, it was the companionship that really got me through. I stayed in a large bedroom with 2 single beds and an ensuite bathroom. When I arrived, I was paired with a guy named Andy. Like I said, I wasn't too happy to be sharing a room with a total stranger, and while I'm sure the hostel was just happy to pack their rooms out with paying guests, it was a buddy system by design. After hours, when the hostel was kept running by a skeleton crew, roommates could keep each other accountable, and like I also mentioned, that's what really got me sober.
Heroes go hungry.
Andy's situation was almost identical to mine. His wife had an affair, she kept the house, he got addicted to crack and heroin, then lost almost everything.
Minions have spawned.
He said the only thing that stopped him from just ending it all was the idea of his daughter growing up without a dad. So right when he hit rock bottom, he begged an old friend to help him get a place at the wellness center. It was a familiar story, and we initially bonded over our shared experiences and football chat. But then, by the time we were going through the worst of the withdrawals together, I was actually shocked at how much me and Andy had bonded. We could barely get out of bed, either from shakes and chills or just raw depression, and although all the staff and nurses that visited us were fantastic, it was mutual support and solidarity that really got us through. But even after the worst, the physical symptoms of withdrawal had
Is my
subsided.
kind of burden.
This black cloud of soul-crushing depression remained over me, and in a moment of madness, I made a serious error of judgment. As I might have mentioned, our presence at the hostel was entirely voluntary, meaning we could just leave and visit some nearby shops if we felt well enough. Mentally speaking, I've been feeling the worst I'd ever felt, so Andy suggested that he nip to the shop so he could pick us up something sugary. We weren't eating very well at the time, and quick hits of glucose were all that was keeping us fueled at one point. I took Andy up on the offer and gave him a few quid to get some Mars bars, then he told me he'd be back in a few and walked out the door. I then got up, walked into the bathroom, threw one of my disposable razors down onto the floor and stomped on it until the blade came loose. I was going to step into a warm shower, then I was going to cut my wrists and let myself bleed out under the hot water to stop the blood from clotting. I just couldn't imagine being able to get back on top in life. I couldn't imagine being a normal person again. Whatever was going on in my brain is hard enough to even articulate. I think I was just going through a complete nervous breakdown. I'd never considered taking my own life before, and I haven't since. But in that bleakest of bleak moments, I just didn't want to be alive anymore.
Kings come and go, but gold.
I know I dithered over it. I don't know how long for, but I know I spent a long time trying to gather the courage to go through with it. Then, when I'd finally convinced myself there was no other way out, right when I was about to run the blade along my forearm to open up every blood vessel I could, I heard Andy walk through the door to our room. I was faced with this now or never moment, but I realized I couldn't do it. Not if Andy was going to be the one to find me or have to deal with trying to save my life when I just didn't want him to.
There were no locks on the bathroom doors, and when he didn't see me in the room, Andy poked his head into the bathroom to see if I was okay. He'd already saved my life by that point, just his presence stopped me from going through with it. But when he saw the broken razor and put two and two together, he restrained me until I dropped it. That was a messy one, probably the worst day of my life, but the point is that I genuinely believe that Andy saved my life that day. If I had been in the room on my own, I wouldn't be around to write this. I got a lot of counseling and therapy after that, and a doctor stopped by with a prescription of some antidepressants, but again, the biggest help was Andy. He was the one who told me that it was just a moment of madness, that I didn't have to be ashamed, and that things were going to get better for me. He talked me through the whole thing, and for a long time, I believed I owed him my life. Andy got out of the wellness program about 6 weeks before I did, but we kept in touch and met up for a coffee when I got out. Rebuilding our lives honestly kept us both very busy, so it's not like me and Andy met up often, but we kept in touch daily, and over time, he became the best friend I had in the world. We rebuilt our lives in parallel, helping each other out every step of the way. Then right when I thought the pair of us were basically in the clear, I got a phone call from him late one evening, asking if I could do him a favor. When I asked what this favor entailed, Andy's voice got all serious, and he told me it was something he couldn't go to anyone else with, and something he couldn't talk about over the phone. I found that a bit ominous, and I instantly understood that he'd broken the law in some way, but I never could have guessed how terrible things really were. I gave Andy my address, but he insisted on meeting me in the car park with a quick save that was about 10 minutes walk from the flat I was staying in. Just a year previous, I'd never have met a mate in a dark car park after they'd told me in so many words that they'd done something terrible against the law. I'd have just told them to be honest or to go to the police if it was really serious. But times change, and I'd changed too. I don't know if you've ever felt like you owed someone your life before, but if you haven't, there's no other feeling quite like it. The only thing I can remotely compare it to is the feeling you have for your mom or dad. You wouldn't exist without the person who saved your life. You owe them everything. So even if they ring you up and give you some really dodgy story about needing your help, you go running to help them. I spotted this car in the quick save car park, walked over to it, and climbed in the passenger seat. Right away, I could sense how bad things were. When I asked Andy what was going on, he repeated all the stuff about not being able to turn to anyone else. He never came out and said that I owed him one. I don't even think that he really saw it that way, but I felt indebted enough to at least hear it out. He told me he needed help shifting something. And at first, I misinterpreted that as him saying that he needed to sell something that was probably drugs. Andy had always been an alcoholic, see. He'd been into all sorts of stuff before he decided to go into rehab. So my guess was that this favor was somehow connected to all of that. But then, when I asked him what we were shifting, he just told me it was in the boot of his car, and that afterwards, he'd need help cleaning the boot out. And that's when this cold, sick feeling spread through my stomach, and I asked Andy to tell me exactly what was in his boot.
It's bought.
He stayed quiet for a second, but he was visibly trembling when I followed up by asking him if there were drugs in his boot. He just shook his head, and that's when I knew. I just knew it from the way he was acting. There was a body in his boot, a dead body. When I asked him if that was the case, if he was actually asking me to help him dispose of human remains, he just nodded. I remember exactly how I felt that night, sitting in the passenger seat of his old Rover, realizing that my best mate in the world was asking me to risk everything for him. I could feel my heart thumping in my chest as this cold sweat started to soak in my armpits, and I'm ashamed to say that just for a second, I actually considered helping him, at least until I asked who it was. He took a while to answer me, and I could see him struggling to hold back the tears, but eventually he managed to squeeze out the words, "The wife, and the fella I found her with." 2 dead bodies. Not one, but 2. I remember cupping my hands over my mouth at that, and I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. But all the while, there was this voice in my head telling me that I owed him my life, and that I should help him no matter the cost. But then, Helping Andy cover up 2 murders wouldn't really be helping him. The guilt would keep him alive. The police might eventually catch him. In that case, I'd go to prison too for helping him dispose of 2 bodies. I'd like to be able to tell you that my mind was made up by my morals and that as much as I loved Andy as a friend, I couldn't bring myself to cover up such a hideous misdeed. But it wasn't that. It was nothing but pure, selfish fear. I did the right thing for the wrong reasons, and I told him I couldn't help him. Andy then asked if I was going to go to the police, and from the heart, I told him I didn't know. I'll never forget how cold he suddenly sounded when he realized I might turn on him, and what he told me in that dark car sends absolute chills through me. Then all these years later, you know I can't let you out now, don't you? Andy was a person I'd grown to feel 100% safe around. So, for that feeling to suddenly
Get
shift
paid
until I
and
felt
get
like
out.
he might be about to kill me, it had me so scared that I was shaking in my seat. I asked him if he was going to hurt me, and he told me, I don't want to, but I will if you make me. I spent the next few minutes pleading my case, or more accurately,
You can't take
pleading
it.
for my life. I told him the same thing I'd mentioned previously, that he was bound to get caught since a woman's addict ex-husband is always bound to draw
Shut down.
suspicion. It's just a matter of time, and he couldn't live forever. The best thing to do would be to turn himself in, and to let me go to the police so I didn't get any time either when the truth finally came out. I think the thing that actually convinced him, the thing that saved my life, was when I was mentioning not calling the police until I got back to my flat. That was at least a 10 to 15 minute head start for him to think about what he was going to do. Somehow, he agreed. And after I pleaded with him one more time to do the right thing, he told me to get out of his car. And the walk back to my flat was the longest 10 minutes of my life. The whole way I had this horrible fear that Andy was going to change his mind, turn around in his car, and run me over at high speed after mounting the curb. That, or he'd be waiting for me in the driveway of my building, ready to ambush me with the same thing he killed his wife with. I know this might sound mental, but I remember thinking how if he really did drive back and run me over, he'd be justified. I owed him my life, and I just turned my back on him when he needed me the most. Not only that, but I was going to actively betray him by informing the police about what he told me. Don't get me wrong, part of me was angry that he got me involved in the first place, but truth be told, a lot of what I was feeling on that walk was guilt. Rotten, festering guilt. I got back
I've
to the
got
flat,
values.
picked up the phone, and called the police. I told them everything Andy had told me. They promised to send someone over as soon as possible, and then I sat down on the only piece of furniture I had in the living room and just cried.
Your team has
I never could
destroyed
have
a
imagined how
turret.
doing the right thing could have hurt so much. But life is full of surprises that way. Just like I never had imagined plotting to take my own life after the love
Laws
of
or
my life
whatever
had disappeared
works
on
at
me.
the time.
But then, that's why Andy had to go to prison. It hurt something awful to let my ex-wife go, but I had to. I had no other choice. The right thing to do was to let her find happiness, even if that was in the arms of another man.
Heroes.
Andy had left his wife with a chance of that. I don't blame him for descending into a rage when he saw another man making himself comfortable in the place he'd called home for so many years. But it didn't warrant a death sentence. It wasn't fair. And that's what I told myself as I sat there waiting for the officers to arrive. Over a few cups of tea, I told them everything I knew. And after they left, I tried to go on as best I could with my life.
Shut down.
I didn't hear back from any police officers, and for a few weeks I expected to wake up in the middle of the night to see Andy standing over me with a knife or something. And if he did, I'd understand why. Those few weeks were the closest I'd ever come to falling off the wagon, but I kept it together.
Shut
And
down.
enough time passed for it to fall to the back of my mind. I didn't stop thinking about Andy, though. He popped in my head at least once a day, and I'd wonder where he was and how he was doing. Sometimes I
Turret
imagined him in
plating will
prison.
soon fall.
Other times I imagined him on the run.
Wealth
and
is my
sometimes
kind
I
of
imagined
burden.
him in the worst places. And I wondered how I'd go about finding him if he ended up dead or in prison. We have a system here in the UK called Find a Prisoner, and a few years ago, I used it to reach out to Andy to find out if he was in prison.
Honor is the
I
rust
found out
on a
that he was
dull
in
blade.
Wakefield prison, so I reached out to him. He'd been there for me at my lowest, so the least I could do was return the favor, even if I had helped put him there in the first place. It took a while to receive a reply, but eventually I heard back from him. I still have that letter tucked away somewhere safe, still with the tear stains on it when I read the part where he wrote, "I forgive you."
Shut down.
Just over 6 years ago, me and my husband found a wonderful little rental home out in the suburbs that was what I can only describe as suspiciously cheap. We went for viewing and the interior was incredible, and we left wanting to move in even more. But this completely flummoxed me and my husband as we were determined to find out what the catch was. Eventually we found it, and what kept the place so affordable was the fact that it was adjacent to a bail hostel. This meant that if we moved in, we'd be living opposite people who were fresh out of prison, and we'd be living that way for the foreseeable future. It wasn't like we were living next to an ex-con, someone we could get to know, someone who had already been rehabilitated and had settled down after a wild youth. No. Our neighbors would be newly released on God knows what charges, and we just have to hope we didn't have any bad encounters with any of them. As it turned out, living opposite the bail hostel was almost completely uneventful. Granted, some of the people we saw coming and going from the place definitely looked a little suspicious, but the vast majority looked like perfectly normal people. They were probably just so glad to have their freedom that they didn't act up while staying. So, the first floor of our house was about 4 foot off the ground, and our kitchen window gave me an almost perfect view of the bail hostel across the street. This meant that every time I was washing up, cooking, baking, or doing laundry, the washing machine was in the kitchen. I'd have a pretty clear view of people coming to and from the bail hostel. I guess this just makes me sound incredibly nosy, but just knowing it was a bail hostel had me very interested in those coming and going, obviously. You could tell when a person was a parole officer or some other kind of official, as they were wearing a suit or an ID badge or something of that nature. And I've already told you about the folks who were obvious drug addicts from the way they looked. But then every so often, you'd see someone walking out who looked way too normal to have been to prison. Those are the ones I found myself studying a little more intently, just wondering what could have happened to lead them astray, along with what they'd actually done to be locked up. For years we lived in almost complete tranquility.
The only thing
Then one
I look up
day,
to is the sky.
that peace was shattered. This one day, I was washing some dishes when another one of those very ordinary criminals came walking out of the bail hostel. He looked to be in his 40s, was slightly overweight, and had a ring of red hair crowning the balding head. He just looked like a regular dad type, and as I wondered if he'd picked up one too many DUIs or had gotten involved in some kind of financial crime, a car pulled up next to the driveway of the bail hostel. Whoever was in the passenger seat must have done something to get the red-headed man's attention, because he walked over to the passenger window and leaned down as if to better see who he was talking to. Then, in an instant, I saw a puff of
It's not
smoke
Steve.
followed by a bang, and the man's face disappeared into a slurry of gore. I instinctively dropped down out of sight and then grabbed my phone off the countertop before dialing 911. I wasn't scared of any more shooting, as I've heard the car's tires screech as it sped off, but I was so freaked out that I didn't want to
I've
emerge
got
from the cover of
values.
the kitchen
They
cabinet.
stack up nicely.
All just instinct, I suppose. So when I told the 911 operator what had happened, she put me through to the police dispatcher, and when I told them what happened, the dispatcher asked me to stand up and take a look at the victim.
Your team
I
has
told him I'd rather
destroyed
not
an
do that, but the
inhibitor.
dispatcher said they
An
needed to
ally
know two
has been
things:
slain.
if the victim was moving or breathing, or if they were armed.
An ally
I
has
told
been
him
slain.
that I didn't know if I could, but the dispatcher actually pleaded with me, saying that the victim's life was at stake, and if I wanted to help, I'd do as they asked me. It seemed a little harsh at the time, but I guess they're paid to save
Your turret has
lives,
been
not to be
destroyed.
nice, and it got me to do what they were asking, so I guess it worked. If I'd known what I was about to see, I'd never have stood up and looked at all. The man wasn't moving, and thankfully, I didn't have a very good view of the bloody
Your
mess
turret
that
has
used to
been
be his
destroyed.
face. But that's not what really traumatized me that day. I took cover the moment I saw it happen, so obviously I didn't see this, but whoever had blown his
An
face
enemy
off
has
had taken
been
the time to
slain.
step out of the car, pull the guy's pants off, and cut something very prominent off of his lower half.
Double kill.
As soon as that registered with me, I sank down beneath the sync unit again, then told the dispatcher that he wasn't moving. There was no gun, and that respectfully, I wouldn't be looking at the man's body again. Not long after, I heard the first sirens, and within the hour, the whole
Wealth
street was
is my
filled with
kind of
emergency
burden.
service vehicles. Obviously, since I was the only witness to the man's murder, I spent an awful lot of time being interviewed by the police. But as much as I tried to be as helpful as I could, I'm not sure that the case went anywhere.
Your team
The only thing I learned about the dead man in the time after that was that he was a registered offender against children. But whether or not that had anything to do with his murder is anyone's guess. What I do know is, what I saw that day is the single most horrifying thing I've ever seen in my life. And if it wasn't a single isolated incident, I think we'd have moved a long time ago.
enemy double kill.
During the summer of 2020, a 27-year-old Frenchman named Jan Bourdon defied pandemic-era travel restrictions to embark on the trip of a lifetime. According to friends and family, Jan was a highly sociable young man with the hunger for knowledge of travel. He had studied history at the prestigious Parisian Sorbonne University. At first,
Kings
Jan
come
made his
and
way
go,
from his home
but
city in
gold
Paris to
stays.
Vilnius, the capital of
Your
Lithuania.
team has destroyed
Then,
a
after a few
turret.
weeks of exploring the cobblestone
team
streets
has
of the
destroyed
medieval
a
town,
turret.
Jan turned his gaze southward. He traveled via bus and trains to Hungary, Croatia, and Bulgaria, taking his time to soak up each region's distinct culture and history before moving on. After more than a year of traveling, Jan ended up in the favored Turkish capital of Istanbul. Then, following a week or so of wandering the city's ancient but vibrant bazaars, Jan set his sights on Egypt and traveled by plane to a popular tourist town known as Sharm el-Sheikh on July 25th of 2021. Jan kept himself extremely busy during his time in Egypt and regularly kept his friends and family updated on the things he got up to. He sent them a panoramic photograph taken at the summit of Mount Sinai, followed by pictures of the spiritual oasis at St. Catherine's Monastery, and spoke of how warm and welcoming the local Egyptians could be.
You can't.
One
take
such
the
email
desert.
was sent on July 28th of 2021 and detailed the hospitality of a man Jan described as an off-duty police officer. It's not clear how he and Jan met, but this police officer promised Jan a ride to the Egyptian capital, Cairo, if Jan could meet him in the port city of Suez. If his email is to be believed, Jan and the police officer met for dinner on the evenings of July 28th, then traveled with him to Cairo the following day, and he eventually informed his sister of his safe arrival in an email dated August 4th. Jan talked of the excitement he felt at having visited Cairo's ancient Coptic quarter,
I make my
then
own.
mentioned how he was staying in a small hostel along with a number of other travelers, and that he'd be in touch with them soon. In his quest to travel off the beaten path, Jan often found himself in areas with poor internet and cell phone reception. So when a few weeks went by and Jan's family had yet to hear from him, they didn't immediately worry for his safety. Yet when his mother's birthday rolled around and Jan failed to make any kind of contact, his family began to suspect something was wrong. Jan
enemy's
always made a point
inhibitor
of
is
calling family and
respawning.
friends on their birthdays or during the holidays, so his failure to do so that September was completely unfair.
Unstoppable.
Come November, Jan's family still hadn't heard from him, so they contacted the French Foreign Ministry to officially report him missing. The French Foreign Ministry then contacted Egyptian authorities via their Cairo embassy, but were confused by the claims of Egyptian officials who claimed that Jan had never stepped foot onto their country's soil. This obviously perplexed his family, who were in possession of several photographs of Jan posing next to famous Egyptian landmarks. To claim Jan was no longer in Egypt would be one thing, but
for Egyptian authorities to deny that he'd ever been
It's not
there was
stealing if
extremely
they're dead.
disconcerting. French police then set about analyzing Jan's financial records in order to paint a picture of his movements. And it was through this method of investigation that they noticed something curious. 4 days after his final correspondence, Jan's bank card had been used at an ATM near the Sadat subway station in Cairo's Tahrir Square. Whoever used it did so on 4 separate occasions and had completely emptied Jan's bank account in the process. Suspecting that some kind of robbery may have occurred, French police then attempted to trace Jan's movements using security camera footage. Their first point of inquiry was the Cairo hostel Jan had claimed to be staying at. But when police contacted the owners, they claimed that no one under the name of Jan Bourdoun had checked in with them over the previous few months. French police then asked the hostel to provide them with their reception area's security camera footage from the date Jan arrived in Cairo. But worryingly, the hostel claimed to have misplaced the footage from this particular day. To the horror of both investigators and Jan's family, it seemed that a genuine conspiracy was afoot, as efforts had clearly been made by the Egyptian authorities to slow or frustrate their investigation. For almost an entire year, the French government petitioned the Egyptians on behalf of the Bourdoun family, demanding they share any information on Jan's well-being and whereabouts. When Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi visited Paris for a diplomatic meeting in July 2022, Jan's family protested his arrival, holding placards which read, "Where is Jan Bourdoun, President Sisi?" The family also enlisted the help of the Swiss-based non-profit organization Committee for Justice, who agreed that the Egyptian state was somehow involved in Jan's disappearance. The organization then submitted a complaint to the United Nations Bureau of Involuntary Disappearances, who in turn pressured Egypt to conduct a full and transparent investigation. Then, during July of 2022, journalists from the Italian newspaper La Stampa reached out to the Bourdoun family to inform them that Jan's disappearance was eerily similar to that of 28-year-old Giulio Regini. Giulio was an Italian student who vanished from the streets of Cairo back in 2016. Right around the time his family reported him missing, his mutilated corpse was found dumped in a ditch alongside the Cairo-Alexandria highway. And an independent investigation showed that his killers might have been Egyptian security officials.
I always take my toll.
Naturally, this
Blood
caused the
or
Bourdoun
gold.
family a great deal of concern, who still hoped to bring Jan home on his feet and not in a box. But over time, they too were forced to accept the possibility that their worst fears had come true. Although it was increasingly clear that they were preparing for the worst, the Bourdoun family continued their campaign into August of 2022. Then suddenly, in the early hours of August 9th, Jan's mother received a phone call from what appeared to be an Egyptian number. When she answered the call and heard the voice on the other end, she felt a wave of relief so overwhelming that it made her knees buckle. It was Jan. He was alive, and he was coming home. Jan disembarked from an Egyptian air flight that landed in Paris the following day, and was greeted by scores of friends and family wishing to celebrate his safe return. Yet despite being visibly happy at the reunion, those close to Jan noticed that his mood seemed unusually subdued for someone who had escaped some kind of shady, off-the-books imprisonment. Dozens of French media outlets rushed to secure an interview with their newly released compatriot. Yet despite offering ever-increasing amounts of money, Jan has flat-out refused to speak publicly about his ordeal. At first, some interpreted Jan's silence as a litigative tactic, one which would precede some kind of legal action against a private Egyptian enterprise, or even the Egyptian government itself. However, over the last few months, Jan's lack of media outreach has proven to be very out of character for someone with a legitimate grievance. It's not unusual for an aggravated party to announce their intention to take someone to court, even when their defendant is a large multinational corporation or foreign government. So, in this case, the question remains, why has Jan remained so tight-lipped regarding his disappearance? Perhaps the biggest clue to why Jan had stayed so quiet pertains to the kidnapping and murder of the Italian student, Giulio Regini. Following Giulio's disappearance on January 25th of 2016 and the discovery of his body just a few days later, Italian authorities launched a thorough investigation into his death. Just months later, it was announced that the Italians had singled out 5 Egyptian nationals they suspected of being involved in Giulio's detention, torture, and murder. All 5 were members of Egypt's National Security Agency. It should also be noted that Giulio was researching alternatives to the long-standing domination of Egypt's economy by the state and the military, an endeavor which could have been misinterpreted as inciting some kind of rebellion. If this was indeed the case, and the Egyptians confused Giulio with some kind of spy, then it stands to reason that their NSA would want to ascertain his purpose in their country. Yet instead of a long and harsh interrogation, the NSA subjected Giulio to a truly nightmarish torture session and thus placed him in a horrifying predicament. Protest his innocence and face more torture, or lodge a false confession to stop the agony and face the repercussions of international espionage. Considering the condition his corpse was found in, it's more than likely that Giulio refused to make a false confession and was subsequently tortured to death. Perhaps under the advice of his new police officer friend, Jan was placed in a hostel whose
Laws or
management
whatever
was in
works
league
at
with
the
Egyptian
time.
authorities. This placed Jan in a position to be swiftly snatched up by security agents once they decided to question him, and would explain why the establishment suddenly misplaced the CCTV footage, which would have proven he was there. Then, in order to avoid the same mistakes of Giulio Regini's detention and eventual death, perhaps Egyptian security officials pursued a different tactic in order to coax a confession from the subject. Perhaps a less physical form of torture was used in favor of the considerably more psychological one so horrific that it ensured Jan's media silence. What if an elaborate blackmail scheme was put into place, with Jan's interrogators recording themselves doing something to him during his detention, something they threatened to release
It's not
online if he
stealing
ever
if
spoke
they're
of his
dead.
ordeal?
Minions has spawned.
Or perhaps while digging through Jan's personal history, Egyptian security officials discovered one of his deepest, darkest secrets. That would certainly explain why someone with such a pronounced grievance would opt to remain silent among a veritable media firestorm. There's always a chance that the explanation is far simpler, and that Egyptian officials promised Jan
Honor
that his
is the
loved ones
rust
would
on a
suddenly
dull
befall
blade.
a variety of accidents if he ever talked to the media. If Jan was indeed detained for the better part of a year and was subject to regular interrogations, there's no doubt that his captors would have extracted detailed information regarding his family, friends, and personal life. If this was the case, and Jan genuinely feared for their safety, it would certainly explain his reluctance to give extensive media interviews. Despite the amount of research I put into Jan's vanishing and reappearance, all of my theories amount to nothing more than speculation. The only people who know what happened to Jan over the last year are the
Everyone has
man
a price.
himself and the Egyptian officials who have been so obviously duplicitous in their explanations. We can only hope that in the near future, Jan finally decides to reveal what happened to him during his period of detention, and that the French government provides adequate protections against any potential reprisal. Until then, all we can do is wait and wonder, while hoping that Jan's story can serve as a warning to those who wonder where they may not be welcome.
It's Bob.
Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content.
Australia's Byron Bay is one of the most popular tourist destinations on Earth, with approximately 2 million yearly visitors reveling in the small coastal town's sun, sand, and surf. During the summer months, it's believed that the number of tourists in Byron outnumbers the town's permanent residents, and the vast majority of these visitors are a very particular kind of traveler: backpackers. The backpackers who visit Byron Bay each summer tend to be between the ages of 18 to 25 and share an interest in experimentation, spirituality, and recreation. As a result, Byron has garnered a reputation as being something of a hippie hub, a place which attracts as many yogis as it does party animals. And it's this reputation which attracted an 18-year-old Belgian man by the name of Theo Hayes. By late May of 2019, Theo had spent the better part of a year traveling around Australia following the suspension of his engineering studies. He spent a great deal of time in the company of his cousin, Lisa Hayes, who had played a huge role in convincing a reluctant Theo to give traveling a try. Lisa later said that unlike many of his peers who had flocked to Byron for the town's party scene, Theo was content to remain sober and lucid during his time there. He was responsible and mature, wise beyond his years, and he made a point of calling his parents every few days to reassure them that everything was fine. Theo arrived in Byron Bay on Wednesday, May 29, 2019, with his plan being to spend a few days in town before traveling back to his home in Belgium via Melbourne and Sydney. Upon his arrival, Theo checked into the Wake Up Hostel, located about 20 minutes walk outside of the town center. The Wake Up is one of the most upmarket of Byron Bay's hostels, offering complimentary transport and single-person accommodation, and it definitely constitutes one of Byron's most tranquil places to stay. But still, there came a point when Theo decided to celebrate his travels in a typical teenage fashion. On the evening of May 31st, Theo joined a handful of his fellow wake-up guests in visiting a liquor store located in Byron's Northern Hotel. The hotel's security camera footage captured Theo and his friends purchasing a bottle of rose wine at approximately 7:45 p.m. They seemed to be acting perfectly normal during the transaction, and then once they had obtained their alcohol, Theo and his friend caught the shuttle back up to Wake Up. There, they shared the wine with some of the other guests in the hostel's common area, before deciding to head over to a popular backpacker bar named Cheeky Monkeys. It's quite clear that Theo was under the influence of alcohol by that point, as a visit to a bar like Cheeky Monkeys was extremely out of character for him. Cheeky Monkeys had a reputation of being the rowdiest place in Byron Bay, and this is probably down to the fact that it didn't close its doors until the early hours of the morning. After midnight, Cheeky Monkeys' patrons tend to be so intoxicated that violent incidents are a nightly occurrence, and at one point, the bar was ranked as one of the most violent in the whole of Australia. It seems odd that Theo would seem content to visit such a place, even if he had been drinking, but his behavior inside the bar itself was even more out of character. According to the people he was drinking with that night, Theo had only consumed one glass of wine back at the Wake Up, and it was only his second drink at Cheeky Monkeys when his behavior took a distinctly perturbing turn. By 11 p.m., Theo seemed to go from relatively sober to highly intoxicated in less than half an hour, and the last his new friend saw of him was when he was being escorted off the premises by the bar's security staff. A handful of Theo's party members went to check on him, but after he assured them that he wasn't too drunk to get back to their hostel, they simply wished him good night and carried on drinking. I'll believe that Theo was capable of making it back to the hostel, even if it was a little wobbly on his feet. In reality, this was the last time anyone would see him alive. Instead of heading straight back to the hostel, Theo took something of a detour. We know that Theo had headed down to Kingsley and Johnson Street, both viable routes back to the hostel, but from there, he appears to have gotten turned around. According to his phone records, we know that Theo messaged several members of his family and friends via WhatsApp, and that he used Google Maps on a number of occasions in an attempt to navigate back to his hostel. Yet instead of following the suggested route, Theo walked from Kingsley Street onto Tennyson Street in the direction of Byron's Bay's Youth Activity Center. This is the complete opposite direction to the Wake Up Hostel, so either Theo was too drunk to comprehend the directions he was being given, or he had some other reason entirely for his impromptu detour. It's this second idea we're forced to seriously consider, as after arriving at the Youth Activity Center, Theo began walking very quickly towards a street known as Mill Track. According to his phone's metadata, the speed at which he walked away from the activity center was almost twice as fast as his regular walking speed. This could well be down to his frustration at getting himself lost, with Theo wishing to make up for the lost time by increasing his walking speed. However, there's always a chance that Theo increased his walking speed because he felt that he was in danger. Instead of sticking to the poorly lit streets, Theo walked about halfway down one track, then turned off into some dense, dark woodland. Despite the almost impenetrable
down.
foliage, Theo maintained his rapid walking speed as he made his way through the brush. Jagged branches and biting thorns must have cut his arms and legs to ribbons, yet still he made an effort to move as quickly as possible. Theo might have been intoxicated, but clearly believed that suffering a few cuts and grazes was preferable to whatever was pursuing him. After emerging from the other side of the brush, Theo found himself on a stretch of
An ally
beach
has
near a
been
place known
slain.
as Tallow Beach.
An enemy has
This
been
is where the
slain.
trail runs cold. The last time his phone connected to the Cape Byron cell tower was 1:42 p.m. the following day.
Dead.
After that, it appears to have been turned off. Theo didn't return to the hostel. He didn't board the Greyhound bus. He didn't catch his flight back to Belgium. Then after a few days of silence, Theo's mother contacted the Australian authorities to file a missing persons report. Knowing they had already lost around 72 hours of valuable search time, the Australian police rushed into action. A team of around 50 officers combed the area around Byron Bay, with airborne search units accompanying ground teams equipped with drones and cadaver dogs. Theo's parents, Laurent and Vincent, flew over to Australia to assist in the search effort, and the couple made multiple appeals to the Australian public to keep their eyes open for any sign of their boy. When I left Belgium, I promised Theo's little brother I would bring his brother home. Theo's father said, "Please help me keep my promise to him." As the search for Theo progressed into the summer months, Theo's parents petitioned the Australian government to continue their search for their missing son. Their persistence led to the discovery of a gray puma hat in the brush near Tallow Beach during July of 2020, one identical to the one Theo was wearing at the
An
time he
enemy has
disappeared.
been slain.
While it would be entirely reasonable to assume that Theo lost his hat due to his advanced state of intoxication, it seemed more than likely that it was knocked off by a branch as he ran through the dark patch of brush. If there was no urgency or threat to the situation, it stands to reason that a person would have stopped walking to at least try to look for their hat. But Theo didn't, and this is one of the strongest indicators that he wasn't just drunk that night. He was being pursued. Yet without any solid eyewitness statements, there was no way for police to conclusively prove that Theo was being chased by anyone, and frustratingly, they turned to other explanations for his disappearance. The general consensus among law enforcement was that either misadventure or him taking his own life were to blame for Theo's death. In their eyes, there was only one feasible explanation for his disappearance. His body had been carried away by the tides after he'd fallen off some cliffs near a local lighthouse.
Kings come
When his parents insisted that Theo had everything to live for, and that he had no history of mental health problems, the Australian police simply fell back on the idea that the fall was the result of severe intoxication. They seemed to completely ignore the speed at which Theo had been moving, as well as the idea that his movements were designed to be evasive. If Theo was being pursued by someone with ill intentions, this might explain why his body had never been found, as it had been disposed of somewhere that it was guaranteed not to wash up on the shore again. But who could Theo have offended so badly that they wished to see him dead? It turns out that one of the only reasons Theo's drinking buddies believed him to be highly intoxicated was the fact that he was escorted out by cheeky monkeys. Drinkers who have reached their limit are often escorted out of bars by its security staff, and such occurrences were commonplace at a place like Cheeky Monkeys. But the fact remains that Theo only had 2 or 3 drinks by the time he was ejected from the premises, and Theo's drinking buddies didn't actually witness the events that led to Theo's ejection. Maybe Theo had angered another patron that night, either through spilling a drink or flirting with the wrong girl. If this was the case, and the security staff intervened before a confrontation could occur, perhaps the offended party followed Theo out of the bar before chasing Theo through the brush. Perhaps this person then engaged Theo in a physical confrontation, one that ended in his untimely death. And if this confrontation occurred near to the cliffs opposite Byron's lighthouse, all it would take to dispose of Theo's body would be to toss it off the cliff. Such an event would mark a violent, needless end to Theo's life, one with terrifying implications for solo
Wealth
travelers
is
worldwide. But even so, there's a far more chilling theory to explain Theo's disappearance, one which hasn't been properly explored by Australian law enforcement. We've already established that Theo only had 2 or 3 drinks before he was escorted out of the bar,
I make
and while
my
his
own.
low tolerance for alcohol might explain his heavy intoxication, there is another possible explanation for his state of inebriation. Theo's drink may have been spiked. While the identity of the person who spiked Theo's drink might well remain a mystery, their motivations are
Laws are
certainly up for speculation. The only reason anyone spikes a person's drink with a dissociative narcotic is to make them non-combative and easier to control. And the effects of such a drug might explain Theo's inability to follow the directions given to him by Google Maps.
It's not.
The dosage might have been enough to slow him mentally, but it evidently wasn't enough to slow him physically, not at first anyway. Perhaps Theo had the energy and composure to make it through the thick patch of brush and out onto Tallow Beach, but after that, maybe the drug started to take full effect, rendering him incapacitated in the same spot his cell phone's metadata trail ran cold. There remains a possibility that Theo's body was never found, not because it was washed away into the Pacific Ocean, but because he's still alive. Theo didn't take his life that night, nor was he murdered by some angry drunken patron of the bar he'd been drinking in. Theo disappeared because Theo was kidnapped by someone working with a human trafficking ring. When Theo went missing, he joined a list of 2,600 long-term missing people who've disappeared in Australia. 6 of these disappearances occurred within just a few kilometers of Byron Bay, and none of these people have ever been found. 54-year-old Ellen Wilson went missing on September 11th of 2015 and was last seen at her Byron Bay hotel before departing in her silver Subaru station wagon. The following morning, Ellen arranged to meet a friend in Ballina, and when she failed to show up, her friend reported her missing. Ellen Wilson
Get
was
paid,
never
get out.
heard from again. 51-year-old mother of 2 Ronnie Wingfield was last seen at her home in Lennox Head, a small coastal town just south of Byron Bay. She was reported missing 11 days after she disappeared on May 27th of 1993. In the absence of her dead body, the examining coroner recommended that a known person be charged with her murder. But sadly, law enforcement simply did not have enough evidence to charge this person of interest. Years later, in 2009, police reopened the investigation into her disappearance and offered a $100,000 reward to anyone with pertinent information. But her disappearance remains unsolved. Margaret Ryan and Jeffrey Neville disappeared from the town of Mullumbimby in 1986 and 1993 respectively. And just like the other cases, their bodies were never found, and they were never heard from again. 23-year-old Rodney Bradridge also disappeared from Mullumbimby, but somehow the Australian police have neglected to draw parallels between his 1997 disappearance and those of the other victims whose bodies have never been found.
The gold stays.
Those who have gone missing around Byron Bay, and particularly those who vanished near Mullumbimby, might well have fallen victim to the same perpetrator, someone who potentially could be linked to a national or international human trafficking ring. Granted, that is pure speculation on my part, but there was clearly something deeply unsettling occurring in the area of Byron Bay and Mullumbimby. If these people were being murdered, why has there never been any forensic evidence of violence? And if their deaths were natural or accidental, why hasn't a single body ever been recovered? These people are simply vanishing from the face of the earth and have been doing so for the better part of 20 years. But without any solid leads or evidence, the Australian police are basically powerless to do anything about it. It's possible that there's an entirely reasonable and innocent explanation for these people's disappearances, and while each remains intensely tragic, that foul play might simply not be to blame. However, if my darkest suspicions are correct, then Byron Bay and the surrounding area have been the same hunting grounds of some very dangerous people for almost 2 decades now. And until there's some kind of break in the case, these people are free to continue kidnapping with mere impunity. So, as the world comes out of lockdown and the travel industry begins to boom once again, be very careful if you decide to go backpacking anywhere, because some of those who visit Byron Bay never see their homes ever again.
Wealth is my kind of burden.
The scariest call I'd ever had as a cop was a medical call involving a 3-year-old girl. My first department I worked for required all officers to be first responder certified. Basic medical training, not enough to be an EMT or medic, but above first aid. We would normally respond to medical calls until the EMTs arrived just to secure the scene. This particular call came out as a 3-year-old girl having a seizure. The location of the call was this battered woman's hostel that we have here in town, with the closest vehicle access being the front entrance, and I had to go on foot to the actual room. When I pulled up to the front, dispatch upgraded the call and informed the girl had just gone into cardiac arrest. I started running to the room, which was nowhere near the front of the hostel, and after finding it, the family was in complete hysterics. I saw the little girl on the ground in the place's communal kitchen, who was still seasoned. However, I could see that she was turning blue in the face. The mom grabbed me and started screaming to save her daughter. I hadn't performed CPR since the academy. I told the mom and everyone to go out into the hallway and for someone to run to the front to guide the EMTs when they arrived. Suddenly, it was now just me and the girl in the room, and the gravity of the situation suddenly hit me. There was no way EMS would get there in time to help her. I paused for about 10 seconds and just tried to collect myself, or
It's not
froze
stealing
up.
if they're dead.
It's cliche, but those 10 seconds I felt were an absolute eternity. Somehow, I snapped out of it and began CPR. And amazingly, with the first compression, she suddenly let out a giant cough and started breathing again.
Full blade.
I've been a police officer for 5 years now, responded to countless fatal wrecks, shootings, stabbings, murder scenes, etc. But nothing was as scary as sitting there on the floor next to that girl, knowing if I didn't do something, she was gone.
Your team has destroyed a turret. An ally has been slain.
Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you get a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, if the raccoons don't get you, the bunny will.
Rampage. Shut down.
You've got a problem. days.
Legendary. Your team has destroyed a turret. An enemy has been slain.
Heroes go high.